Eleanor Hayes drove the iron poker straight through the burning log and did not flinch when the sparks flew up and scorched her wrist. She had bigger things to worry about. Outside, the sky was turning the color of a bruise, that sickly greenish gray that she had learned to fear more than anything else in Wyoming territory. She had seen that sky once before. She had been 12 years old. She still remembered the sound of frozen cattle hitting the ground. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass. It was already cold enough to burn. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very last word, because what happens next will stay with you. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Wyoming Territory, November 1884. Eleanor Hayes had been awake since 4 in the morning. That was nothing unusual. She was always awake before anyone else on Red Hollow Ranch. She was the one who got the fires going, the one who had coffee ready before the first ranch hand pulled on his boots, the one who made certain that breakfast was hot and waiting long before Nathaniel Brooks ever sat down at the head of his table. That was her life. That was what she was for, as far as most people on this ranch were concerned. She had accepted that a long time ago, or at least she had taught herself to act like she had. But this morning was different. This morning, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with the cold seeping through the glass. She pressed her palm flat against the pane and held it there, feeling the chill bite into her skin, and she stared at the sky above the mountains to the northwest, with the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from dread. She had seen that sky before. Not recently, not in the 10 years she had spent in Wyoming Territory, but before that, when she was a girl of 12 living on her father's homestead in the Dakota Badlands. She had woken one morning to a sky exactly that color, that bruised yellowish green, that sat too low and too heavy over the hills like something enormous pressing down from above. Her father had taken one look at it and gone silent in a way she had never seen from him before. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Eleanor, go bring in everything you can carry." They lost 11 cattle that winter. 2 neighbors lost everything. 1 family froze. Eleanor was 31 years old now, and she had not forgotten a single thing about that sky. She pulled her hand away from the glass and turned back to the stove. She cracked 6 eggs into the iron skillet, laid strips of salt pork beside them, and stood there listening to the fat sizzle while her mind worked through everything she needed to do before the day was over. The list was long. The list was going to make people angry. But she had learned a long time ago that doing nothing was its own kind of choice, and she had never been able to make that choice and live with herself afterward. By the time the men started filtering into the kitchen, Eleanor had already made 3 decisions that none of them knew about yet. Hector Vale came in first, the way he always did, loud hat still on boots, tracking mud across the floor she had swept an hour ago. He dropped into his chair and reached for the coffee pot without looking at her. "Smells good," he said, which was the closest Hector ever came to a thank you. Behind him came Pete Rawlings and Cody Marsh, the 2 youngest hands on the ranch, both of them still in that phase of their lives where everything was funny and nothing was serious. They were arguing about something, a card game from the night before, and they sat down still talking over each other, neither one of them glancing in Eleanor's direction. Then Tom Briggs, the foreman, came through the door and went straight to the window to check the weather the way he did every morning. Tom was a careful man, Eleanor had always thought. He noticed things. She had a certain respect for him, even when they disagreed. Tom looked at the sky for a moment. Then he turned back to the room and said, "Looks like weather coming." "It's November," Hector said. "Weather's always coming. This one looks different." Tom said, but he said it the way a man says something he is not fully committed to yet, not the way a man says something he believes down to his bones. Eleanor set a plate in front of Hector without speaking. Then she set plates in front of Pete and Cody. Then she poured Tom's coffee and refilled Hector's cup, and she did all of it without a word, because she was still deciding how to say what she needed to say. She decided the direct way was the only way. "It isn't just weather," she said. The table went quiet the way tables do when someone says something unexpected. All four men looked at her. It was the particular kind of look she had learned to recognize over the years, not hostile, not interested, but somewhere in between. The look of men who are not sure yet whether to be annoyed or amused. "Beg pardon," Tom said. "That's Sky," Eleanor said. She nodded toward the window. "It's going to be a bad one, not a regular November storm. The kind that comes in fast and doesn't leave for days. I've seen that sky before, and I'm telling you what it means." There was a pause. Then Pete Rawlings said, "You a weather prophet now, Miss Eleanor," and grinned at Cody, who grinned back. "I'm not prophesying anything," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even. "I'm telling you what I've seen with my own eyes and what I know from experience. That color up there and the way the horses were acting last night." "The horses are always acting like something," Hector said. He shoveled eggs into his mouth and chewed. "Horses are idiots." "Horses know things we don't," Eleanor said. "Storm is coming in before nightfall, a big one. We need to start moving supplies before the temperature drops any further, and we need to get the cattle closer to the barn, and we need to—" "Eleanor." Tom said her name gently, but there was a firmness underneath it. "We appreciate the concern, but this is ranch business. Mr. Brooks will make the call when he gets back from Laramie this afternoon." "If he waits until this afternoon," she started. "That'll be all," Tom said. Not unkindly, but final. Eleanor closed her mouth. She picked up the empty skillet and walked back to the stove, and she stood there with her back to the room while the men went back to their conversation and their eggs and their coffee. And she breathed slowly and carefully and thought about what she was going to do next, because she had already known they wouldn't listen. She had known it before she opened her mouth. She had lived on this ranch for 3 years, and in 3 years she had learned the shape of her place here as clearly as she knew the shape of her own hands. She was the cook. She was the woman who kept the house. She made the meals and mended the shirts and kept her opinions to herself, and when she forgot that last part, this was what happened. She set the skillet down and untied her apron. She had work to do. Not the work anyone had assigned her, not the work that was expected of her. The work that needed to be done, which was an entirely different thing. She started with the water. The pipes at Red Hollow Ranch ran along the outside of the building on the north side, a fact that Eleanor had noticed within her first week of working there, and that had quietly bothered her every winter since. When the temperature dropped far enough, those pipes froze. She had brought it up once carefully to Tom Briggs, who had nodded and said he would look into it, and then had not looked into it. So Eleanor had developed her own system. She kept 3 large iron pots and 2 wooden barrels in the kitchen, and when she saw weather coming, she filled them. She filled them now. It took 6 trips to the well, and the wind was already picking up by the 3rd trip, biting through her wool coat in a way that made her move faster. By the time she had all the containers filled and covered, her fingers were numb to the 2nd knuckle, and her cheeks were burning. She went back inside and warmed her hands over the stove for 30 seconds. Then she went to the pantry. She had been quietly reorganizing the pantry for the past month, a project she had undertaken without telling anyone, because she knew no one would care until the moment they needed something and couldn't find it. She had moved the most important supplies to the lowest shelves: the flour, the salt pork, the dried beans, the coffee, so that they could be reached easily, even in bad conditions. She had also, over the past 3 weeks, been slowly transferring a second set of supplies to the small back room off the kitchen that was used primarily for storing broken equipment and things no one wanted anymore. She had cleaned that room out. She had put blankets in there and lamp oil and 3 days' worth of food that didn't require cooking, and 2 sets of her own warm clothing and a medical kit she had assembled herself from supplies she'd quietly gathered over the past year. Nobody knew about the back room. Nobody had ever asked. She checked the back room, now went over the inventory in her head, decided it was sufficient. Then she pulled on her coat again and went to the barn. The horses told her everything she needed to know the moment she stepped through the barn door. They were restless in the way that animals get when they understand something that humans haven't figured out yet, moving back and forth in their stalls, ears flat, the whites of their eyes showing. Old Caesar. The big bay gelding that Nathaniel Brooks rode on every cattle drive was pressed into the back corner of his stall, making a sound low in his chest that Eleanor had never heard from him before. She stood in the middle of the barn and listened to them for a moment. Then she started working. She brought in extra hay, far more than the usual daily amount. She filled every water trough she could reach. She checked the barn door latches and found 2 of them loose, and she tightened them with a wrench she found hanging on the wall. She found a gap in the barn siding near the northeast corner, where wind was already whistling through, and she stuffed it with old burlap sacking that she nailed in place with 4 tacks from the workbench. She was on her knees hammering the last tack when she heard footsteps behind her. "What in the world are you doing?" She looked up. Cody Marsh was standing in the barn doorway with his hat pushed back on his head and an expression on his face that sat somewhere between bewildered and entertained. "Fixing a gap," Eleanor said. "In the barn wall." "Yes." "Why?" "Because the wind is going to come through it tonight and make it considerably colder in here for the horses, and the horses are already going to have a difficult enough time." Cody stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "Tom send you out here?" "No." "Mr. Brooks?" "No." Another pause. "So you just came out here on your own to fix the barn wall?" "I came out here to do what needed doing," Eleanor said. She pushed herself up off her knees and picked up the hammer. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Marsh?" He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He had that look young men get when they realize a conversation has not gone the direction they expected, and they aren't quite sure how to recover. Finally, he said, "Pete and me were wondering if you were making biscuits tonight." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "if the storm I'm expecting hits this ranch tonight, biscuits are going to be the least of your concerns." She walked past him back toward the house. She spent the next 2 hours doing things that no one asked her to do, and no one thanked her for. She moved the extra lamp oil from the storage shed closest to the house, where it would be accessible without going out in severe weather. She identified which bedrooms in the ranch house had the worst drafts and wedged rags under the doors and along the window frames. She made a full inventory of the medical supplies in the house and was not surprised to find them low. She added what she could from her own stores in the back room. She was in the middle of heating a large pot of beef stew enough for 12 people, more than twice the ranch's current occupancy, because she believed in being prepared for the unexpected when she heard the front door open and Nathaniel Brooks's voice fill the entryway. "Hell of a ride," she heard him say to someone. "Wind's already picking up on the north road?" She set down her spoon and went to the doorway. Nathaniel Brooks was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending decades outside in Wyoming. He was in his late 40s, well respected in the valley, and he ran Red Hollow Ranch with the particular combination of capability and stubbornness that Eleanor had come to think of as his defining quality. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything important on his own land, which meant he had never fully learned what it felt like to be wrong. He was pulling off his gloves when Eleanor spoke. "Mr. Brooks, I need a word." He looked up. His expression was not unkind, but it was distracted in the way of a man who has just returned from town with a dozen things on his mind. "Eleanor, what is it?" "The weather," she said. "I've been watching it since before dawn. The sky this morning had a particular color that I've only seen once before, and that storm in Dakota in '63 killed livestock across 3 counties and stranded ranches for the better part of a week. I believe we're looking at something similar moving in tonight. I've been taking precautions all day, but there are things that need to be done that are above my authority to order. Eleanor." He said her name the same way Tom had said it, patient, slightly tired. "I appreciate your concern, I genuinely do. But I've been ranching in Wyoming for 22 years. I've seen storms." "I know you have, sir." "And I rode in through the north wind just now, and yes, it's cold, and yes, there's weather coming, but this time of year It's not a regular storm," Eleanor said. She kept her voice quiet. She kept it steady. She had learned that raising her voice accomplished nothing, and in fact actively worked against her, because the moment a woman raised her voice, Men stopped hearing the words and started responding to the sound. "I'm not trying to overstep, Mr. Brooks. I'm telling you what I know. There are signs when a blizzard like this is coming that are different from a regular winter storm, and every single one of those signs is present today." Nathaniel Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, not unkindly but with absolute finality, "Eleanor, leave weather decisions to people who understand ranching." She held his gaze for one moment longer than was perhaps entirely appropriate. Then she said, "Yes, sir," and turned and walked back to the kitchen. She stirred the stew. She let the hurt move through her, and then she set it aside the way she had taught herself to do with feelings that served no practical purpose in the moment. There would be time later to feel whatever needed to be felt. Right now, she had a list. She made 2 more trips outside before the light failed. On the first trip, she went to the secondary barn, the smaller structure on the east side of the property where they kept the farm equipment, and she moved the 2 spare saddles and the emergency rope supply from their hooks on the wall to a wooden crate that she dragged closer to the main barn. If the paths between buildings became impassable, having rope to string a lifeline between them could mean the difference between someone making it and someone not making it. She had read about that once years ago in a newspaper account of a blizzard in Nebraska. She had never forgotten it. On the second trip, she walked the perimeter of the fence line closest to the barn and checked every post she could reach. She found one that was leaning at an angle that concerned her, not broken, but stressed, and she drove 2 extra stakes beside it and lashed them together with wire from the post she found near the fence corner. Her hands were shaking from the cold by the time she finished. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning. She was almost back to the house when she heard Pete Rawlings' voice behind her. "Miss Eleanor." She turned. He was standing just outside the main door, his coat half buttoned, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Less amused than usual. Something more uncertain. "You really think it's going to be bad?" he said. She looked at the sky. It was nearly dark now, and the clouds had moved in from the northwest, with a speed that was itself a kind of answer. The temperature was still dropping. The wind had gone from a gust to a constant low howl. "Yes," she said. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then, "What should I do?" Eleanor looked at him. He was 19 years old. He was scared and he was trying not to show it, but she could see it clearly enough. "Bring in more firewood than you think you need," she said. "Stack it inside the back door, not outside, and make sure your bunkmates know where the extra blankets are." He nodded, started to turn, then stopped. "Why didn't they listen to you this morning?" She considered the question for a moment. "Same reason they wouldn't have listened to me last month," she said. "Or last year. It'll change or it won't. Right now it doesn't matter. Just get that wood." He went. She went inside. The stew was done. She ladled it into the big serving pot, set out the bread she had baked that afternoon. She had made 3 extra loaves without saying why, and rang the bell for supper. The men came in from the bunkhouse and the barn, stamping snow off their boots, and Eleanor noticed the snow with a particular tightness in her chest because it was coming down now steady and thick, and the wind had picked up another degree since she had come inside. The men ate. They talked among themselves. The conversation at the table was a little less relaxed than usual. She noticed there was an awareness in the room that something was changing outside, even if no one was ready to say so directly. Nathaniel ate quietly at the head of the table. He did not look at Eleanor. She cleared the dishes. She washed up. She banked the kitchen fire carefully the way she always did, making sure it would hold through the night without needing constant attention but would also not burn out before morning. Then she went to her room. She did not undress. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in her wool skirt and her warmest shirtwaist and her heavy stockings, and she put her coat across her lap and she waited. At 9 o'clock, she heard the wind change. She had been half dozing, sitting upright, but she came fully awake the moment she heard it, that shift in pitch that meant the storm had found its full voice. It went from a steady howl to something lower and more deliberate, the kind of sound that seemed to come from inside the walls instead of outside them. The temperature in her room dropped 3 or 4 degrees in the space of a few minutes. She could feel the cold coming through the floor. She put on her coat. She put on her boots. She picked up the small lantern from her nightstand and lit it. Then she walked out of her room and went back to work. The kitchen fire needed tending. She stoked it, added 2 more logs than she normally would have. She checked the water containers, still full, still covered. She checked the back door latch, which she had reinforced that afternoon with an additional wooden bar she had found in the equipment room. She was in the process of making a second check of her supply inventory when she heard the first crash. It came from the bunkhouse side of the property. Not a collapse, but the unmistakable sound of something structural being hit by wind. She grabbed her lantern and went down the back hallway, not outside, because she knew better than to go outside in this wind with a lantern, but to the east-facing window at the end of the hall that gave a view of the bunkhouse roof. She could not see much in the dark, but she could see the shadow of something, a shutter, she thought, or possibly the overhang on the south corner, moving in a way it should not be moving. She went back to the kitchen and pounded on the door that connected to the bunkhouse passage. After 30 seconds, she heard boots. Then Tom Briggs's voice. "What?" "Something on the bunkhouse roof is loose," she said through the door. "South side. It needs to be secured before the wind gets worse." A pause. Then, "How bad is the wind?" "Getting worse," she said. "Every hour it gets worse." Another pause, longer this time. Then the door opened, and Tom Briggs stood there in his long underwear with his coat thrown over his shoulders and his hair flat on one side from sleep, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not annoyed, not dismissive. Something closer to afraid. "How long have you been up?" he said. "Since 9 o'clock, she said. "Same time the storm shifted. I checked the fires and the supplies. Everything's holding right now." He stared at her. "You were up," he said slowly, "checking the fires, in the middle of the night." "Someone had to be," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down the hall toward the front of the house where the wind was audible even through the walls. Then he looked back at her. "What do you need me to do?" he said. Those were the first words, the very first words in 3 years that anyone on this ranch had said to Eleanor Hayes that acknowledged she might know something worth listening to. She did not let herself feel it right then. There was no time. "Wake Pete and Cody," she said. "Don't send them out in the wind with the lanterns. Use the rope. I put it in the crate by the east barn door this afternoon. String a line from the bunkhouse to the main barn before anyone goes out there, and tell them to move fast because the temperature's still dropping." Tom Briggs looked at her for 1 more second. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." He turned and went to wake the hands. Eleanor went back to the kitchen and put the coffee on. She stood at the stove, listening to the wind build against the walls of Red Hollow Ranch, and she thought about her father and his voice on that morning in Dakota when she was 12 years old. And she thought about the cattle they had lost and the family that had frozen, and she thought about the 3 years she had spent on this ranch being silent and invisible and careful, and something in her chest felt like it was finally coming loose. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just the particular feeling of a person who has been holding a thing alone for a long time and has finally at 2 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard, been allowed to set it down. She poured herself a cup of coffee. She picked up her list. There was still a great deal of work to do before morning, and Eleanor Hayes had never in her life left work unfinished. The storm howled against the walls like it was making a point. She stirred her coffee and let it make its point. She had already made hers. The coffee was still hot when Tom Briggs came back through the kitchen door, and Eleanor knew from the way he moved fast, deliberate, not looking at her directly, that something had already gone wrong. "The south corner overhang came loose," he said. "Not all the way down, but it's hanging. 1 more gust, and it's going to take part of the bunkhouse roof with it." "How bad is the wind out there?" "Bad enough that Pete nearly went down just crossing from the door to the rope line." He stopped, looked at her. "That rope line you set up this afternoon, that's the only reason he made it back." Eleanor did not say anything to that. "We need to get someone up on that roof," Tom said. No, Eleanor said immediately. He blinked. No, not in this wind. A man on a roof in this wind is a man who comes off that roof in about 40 seconds. She was already moving to the window, not to look out, but to listen, gauging the intervals between the strongest gusts. Is the overhang going to fall on its own, or does it need the wind to take it? Looked like it was mostly the hinge brackets. One bracket's pulled clean out of the wood, other one's still holding, but it's bent. Then it'll hold until morning if no one touches it, she said. The wind's coming from the northwest. That overhang is on the south corner. It's not catching the full force. Leave it. Tom stared at her. Leave it, she said again. If someone goes up there tonight, we're more likely to lose a man than a piece of roof trim. In the morning, when the gusts settle between 4 and 5 in the morning, the way they usually do before they build again, that's when you send someone up. How do you know the gusts settle between 4 and 5? Because I've been awake through enough Wyoming nights to know the pattern, she said. Have you eaten anything since supper? The shift in conversation caught him off guard. He almost laughed. What? Go sit down. I'll heat the stew. He sat down. She had not expected that, not quite so quickly, not without an argument, and for a moment she stood with her back to him, ladle in hand, letting herself absorb the strangeness of it. Tom Briggs, who had been foreman of Red Hollow Ranch for 9 years, who had 30 years of ranching behind him, sitting at Eleanor Hayes's kitchen table at 2:30 in the morning because she told him to. She ladled the stew into a bowl and set it in front of him. He ate 2 bites before he said, You knew this morning, didn't you? Not guessing. Knew. Yes. And I told you to leave it alone. You did. He looked at the bowl. I'm sorry for that. It was not a large apology. It was not delivered with great ceremony. He said it the way a practical man says something he means, but does not know how to dress up plain, direct, a little uncomfortable. It was the sincerest thing anyone on this ranch had said to her in 3 years. Eat your stew, she said. We've got a long night ahead. At 3 in the morning, the wind found a new angle. Eleanor felt it before she heard it, a shift in the pressure inside the house. Subtle the way a room feels different when a door has been opened somewhere. Then the sound changed, dropping from that sustained howl into something more intermittent and violent, hitting the north wall of the house in separate concussive blows that rattled the window frames in their casings and sent a fine drift of cold air through every gap Eleanor had not managed to seal. She was on her feet before the second blow hit. Tom! She crossed to the hallway and raised her voice enough to carry. Tom, wake Pete and Cody. I need them in the kitchen right now. She heard him moving. She went back to the kitchen and pulled on her coat, then pulled on her second coat, over the first the heavy oilskin she had kept on its hook by the back door for the past 2 years. The one the men sometimes joked about because it was too large for her and hung past her knees. She did not care about the jokes right now. She cared about the horses, because the wind had shifted north and the main barn sat due north of the house, and if the temperature dropped another 5 degrees while the wind was hitting it from the full front angle, the horses would be in serious distress within the hour. Tom came in with Pete and Cody behind him. All 3 of them looked at her coat and read the situation in about 2 seconds. Barn, Tom said. Barn, she said. But we do it right. 2 people on the rope line at all times. Nobody goes further from the rope than arm's reach. The wind is hitting from due north now, which means the gap between the house and the barn is a wind tunnel. Does everyone understand what that means? Cody opened his mouth. It means, Eleanor said before he could speak, that the wind in that gap is moving at least twice as fast as what you feel on the open ground. It will knock you off your feet. It will take your lantern. If you fall and lose the rope, we will not be able to find you until morning, and by morning you will be dead. She looked at each of them in turn. Are we clear? Pete's face had gone the color of old chalk. Yes, ma'am, he said, very quietly. Good. Tom, you and I will go. Pete, Cody, you stay inside and keep the fires up. Every fireplace, every stove. If the temperature in this house drops below... She stopped, pressed her hand to the kitchen wall, feeling the cold through the plaster. Keep the fires hot enough that you can see your breath only if you stand within a foot of a window. If it gets worse than that, come to the barn and get me. Use the rope." "What are you going to do in the barn?" Cody asked. "Keep the horses warm enough to stay alive," she said, "and check the feed store because if this storm lasts 3 days, the way I think it will, we need to know exactly what we have." She tied a length of rope around her waist before she opened the back door, handed the other end to Tom, and stepped out into the Wyoming night. The wind hit her like a wall. She had expected it to be bad. It was worse than she expected. The cold was not merely cold, it was the kind of temperature that got inside clothing, that moved through layers like they weren't there, that turned the moisture in your eyes to a stinging sting before you'd walked 5 feet. She kept her head down and her hand on the guide rope she had strung that afternoon, moving hand over hand, counting her steps, the way her father had taught her on the homestead when she was 8 years old. 12 steps to the barn door. 12 steps that took the better part of 2 minutes because the wind was pressing against her hard enough that every step forward required deliberate, planted effort. She got the barn door open. She and Tom fell inside. She pulled the door shut behind them and stood in the darkness, with her heart going hard in her chest and her lungs burning from the cold air she had just been breathing. Tom found the lantern hook by feel and got the lantern lit. The horses were in a state that was one step below panic. Every one of them was moving. Caesar, the big bay in the corner stall, had worked himself into a lather. Despite the cold, she could see the sweat on his neck from where she stood. The younger mare, the roan that Cody called Buttercup, and that Eleanor privately thought was the smartest animal on the property, was pressed against the back wall of her stall, with her ears pinned so flat they were nearly invisible. "Easy," Eleanor said. She did not project the word. She said it at normal conversational volume, which in her experience worked better with frightened horses than anything louder. "Easy, Caesar. Easy, girl." She moved through the barn, talking quietly and steadily, checking each horse, running her hand along their necks and flanks, feeling for the kind of trembling that meant they were losing core heat. 2 of the younger horses were starting to shiver in a way she didn't like. She sent Tom for the extra blankets she had stored in the tack room that afternoon, and they spent the next 40 minutes blanketing horses in a barn that was still warmer than the outside, but not warm enough, not nearly warm enough, and the whole time the wind was hitting the barn walls like it had a personal grievance against the structure. "We need more heat in here," Tom said. "I know." She was already moving toward the back of the barn, where she had noticed on her earlier visit a small iron brazier hanging on the wall, old, covered in dust, probably unused for years. "Help me get this down." "You want to run a fire in the barn?" "Carefully," she said. "Low, away from the hay. I've done it before." She had done it once years ago on her father's homestead, the winter after the bad storm, when 3 horses had died from cold, and her father had said never again. "Get me the sand bucket from the wall. There should be one near the south post." Tom got the bucket. She got the brazier down and positioned it in the center of the barn's open area, well away from every stall, and she built a fire in it that was small enough to be safe and large enough to matter, using the driest wood from the stack she had moved into the barn that afternoon. The horses noticed the heat almost immediately. She watched Caesar's ears come forward. Watched the roan mare stop pressing herself against the back wall. Watched the 2 shivering youngsters begin to settle. Tom Briggs stood beside her and watched the same things. "How did you know to move the wood in here this afternoon?" he said. "I didn't know for certain," she said. "I planned for the possibility." "How many possibilities did you plan for today?" She thought about it. The water containers, the backroom supplies, the rope coil, the fence post, the lamp oil, the extra blankets in the tack room, the 3 extra loaves of bread. "Enough," she said. Tom was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Brooks needs to know," he said, "what you did today. How much of this is because of you?" "Mr. Brooks told me this morning to leave weather decisions to people who understand ranching." Tom winced. It was a small wince, just a tightening around the eyes, but she caught it. "He was wrong," Tom said. Those 3 words landed in the barn with more weight than the man who said them probably understood. "He was Eleanor agreed. She checked the brazier one more time, added one small piece of wood, then stepped back. "Can you manage here for an hour? I need to go back and check the house." "I can manage," he said. She made the return trip along the rope line, fighting the same wind she had fought going out, and when she got through the back door of the ranch house and let it close behind her, she stood in the kitchen for a full 10 seconds just breathing. Pete and Cody had done as she said. The fires were going. The house was cold, but not dangerously cold. Pete was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an expression that was doing its best to look calm and mostly succeeding. "The horses," he said. "Settled," she said. "Tom's with them." He exhaled. "Good." A pause. "Miss Eleanor, I've been thinking." She hung up the oilskin. "About what?" "About this morning, when you told us at breakfast and we—" He stopped, started again. "When I said that thing about you being a weather prophet." She turned to look at him. His face was doing something complicated. He was 19 years old, and he had probably never in his life had to apologize to a woman for something that mattered, and it showed. "I shouldn't have said that," he said. It wasn't right." "No," she said. "It wasn't." "I'm sorry." She held his gaze long enough to let him feel that she meant what she said next. "Thank you, Pete." He nodded, looked at his coffee. "What can I do?" "Stay awake," she said. "Check the fires every 30 minutes. If any of them start burning low, add wood immediately. Don't let them drop." She moved to the pantry and pulled out a piece of salt pork and the end of the bread loaf. "And eat something. You're going to need it." She was back at the brazier in the barn by 4:15, and at 4:23 she felt the wind begin to ease. Not stop, not shift. Just ease that slight drop in intensity that she had described to Tom, the thing she knew from experience that happened in the small hours before a storm gathered itself again. It was a window. Small, maybe 30 minutes, maybe less. "Tom," she said. "The south overhang." He was already on his feet. They worked fast. Tom went up the ladder, not to the roof itself, just high enough to reach the bracket, while Eleanor held the ladder base and kept the light steady and talked him through it. The bracket was bent at a 40-degree angle. Tom straightened it against the barn post with 3 hard strikes from the hammer, drove 2 new nails to replace the pulled ones, and came back down. The whole operation took 11 minutes. At 4:36, the wind picked back up. Tom stood at the bottom of the ladder, breathing hard, and he looked at Eleanor and he said, "You knew that window was coming." "I thought it probably would," she said. "I wasn't certain. But you were ready for it." "I try to be ready," she said. "For most things." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to wonder. "I've been foreman here for 9 years, he said. "I didn't know that overhang bracket was weak. I noticed it in September," she said. "I put it on my list of things to mention." A small pause. "I didn't get around to mentioning it." Tom looked at her. "Because no one was asking," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. No one was asking. The storm hit its second peak between 5 and 6 in the morning. Eleanor knew it was the second peak rather than the worst, because the sound had a different quality, still violent, still dangerous. But with a ceiling to it, a limit, she could sense the way you sense the top of a hill when you're climbing in the dark. She had been awake for 26 hours. She was running on coffee, and the particular kind of clarity that comes after the body gives up on expecting sleep and simply reorganizes itself around alertness. She was in the kitchen when she heard Nathaniel Brooks' footsteps on the stairs. He came into the kitchen in his shirt and suspenders, his hair not yet combed, and he stopped just inside the doorway and looked at her. Really looked at her the way he had not done that morning when she had tried to warn him. She was standing at the stove. She had a cup of coffee in one hand and a pencil in the other, going over the supply inventory she had written out from memory. She looked back at him without expression. He looked around the kitchen. The stocked water containers, the organized supplies, the lamp oil lined up along the east wall. The medical kit open on the sideboard, where she had done a second check inventory at 3 in the morning. He looked at all of it, and his face did something that she could not quite name. Not guilt exactly, not shame exactly, but something in the territory between them. "Eleanor," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. How long has this—" He gestured at the room. "Since before breakfast yesterday," she said. He was quiet. "Tom tells me you went out in that wind twice," he said. "3 times, she said. "Twice to the barn once, to check the east fence post near the north line. That post was going to go in another few hours. It's secured now." He crossed to the table and sat down heavily in his chair. Not the chair at the head of the table, just a chair, like a man who wasn't sure what the head of anything meant right now. "Why didn't you—" He stopped himself. Started again. "If you had—" He stopped again. "I tried to tell you," she said. Her voice was quiet, not accusing, just accurate. "Yesterday morning at breakfast, and again when you came in from Laramie, I told you what the sky meant, and what I thought was coming, and what I thought we should do. You told me to leave weather decisions to people who understood ranching." He flinched. She had not said it to hurt him. She had said it because it was true, and because in her experience, problems that were not spoken clearly tended to repeat themselves. "The horses are alive," she continued. "The barn is intact. The bunkhouse roof lost a shutter mount that is now repaired. The east fence post is secured. The house is warm. Your men are safe." She set down her coffee cup. "That is where we are." Nathaniel Brooks put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a long moment. "You did all of that," he said, "while we were asleep." "Tom and the boys helped when I asked them," she said. "Pete and Cody kept the fires through the night. Tom went out in the wind with me. They did well." He nodded, slowly. "And I," he began. "You came home from Laramie in a storm and sat down to your supper and then went to bed," she said. "And this morning your ranch is still standing." She picked up the inventory list. "I'm going to need you to make some decisions today," she said. "About feed allocation, because the way I've calculated it, we have enough for 4 days at normal consumption, but only if we reduce the grain ration for the draft animals, which means the fence repair work will have to wait until after the storm breaks. That's a decision that belongs to you, not me." He looked up at her. "What's your recommendation?" The word hung in the air between them. Your recommendation. In 3 years on this ranch, Nathaniel Brooks had never asked Eleanor Hayes for her recommendation on anything beyond whether to serve biscuits or cornbread. She felt the weight of the moment. She did not let herself stay in it. "Reduce the draft horses' grain by 1/3, she said. "Increase the hay to compensate for the caloric difference. The cattle in the near paddock need to be checked every 4 hours. I believe 2 of the older cows are already stressed by the cold, and if we lose them, it's more expensive than whatever the grain costs us." She paused. "And you should eat something, Mr. Brooks. There's stew from last night." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said. She turned back to the stove. It was a small thing, that thank you. It was not a solution to anything. It did not give her a new title, or more authority, or the kind of recognition that would change anything permanently. She knew that. She had been in enough rooms, and on enough ranches, to know that one hard night did not transform the order of things. But Tom Briggs had said yes, ma'am, and Pete Rawlings had said, "I'm sorry," and Nathaniel Brooks had said, "What's your recommendation?" And Eleanor Hayes stood at her stove in the worst storm to hit Red Hollow Ranch in a decade, 27 hours without sleep flour and ash still on her hands from the bread she had baked the morning before. And she thought that maybe, not certainly, not yet, but maybe something had shifted on this ranch that was not going to shift entirely back. She poured Nathaniel his coffee. She poured herself another cup. Outside, the storm was still going. She had work to do. At 7 in the morning, Cody Marsh came to find her with a look on his face that cut the brief quiet of the kitchen in half. "Miss Eleanor," he said, "one of the hands is down." She set her cup on the counter. "Which one?" "Old Walt, Bunkhouse. He was on the night watch through the early hours. He was one of the ones checking the east side of the property before the storm got fully bad, and he... Cody swallowed. He's shaking and he can't stop. His lips are blue. Eleanor moved before he finished the sentence. She was through the connecting passage and into the bunkhouse in 45 seconds, and she found Walt Morrison in his bunk with 3 blankets over him and his whole body vibrating with a fine, constant trembling that she recognized immediately, and that tightened everything in her chest into a hard, cold knot. Walt was 63 years old. He had been on Red Hollow Ranch for 12 years. He was a lean, weathered man who had never once in Eleanor's memory made a single complaint about any working condition, which was precisely what worried her now. "Walt," she said. She put her hand on his forehead. His skin was cold. "Walt, can you hear me?" His eyes opened. They were alert, which was something confusion would have been worse. "Miss Eleanor," he said. His voice shook with the trembling of his body. "Think I caught a chill." "You got too cold," she said. "How long have you been back inside?" "Hour. Maybe hour and a half." He tried to sit up. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Stay down," she said. "Don't try to warm up fast. That's the wrong thing to do." She turned to Cody. "Get Tom. Tell him I need the hot water from the kitchen stove not boiling warm, and I need the extra wool blankets from the back room, he knows which room, and I need the tin of dried ginger from the 3rd shelf in the pantry." Cody went at a run. She turned back to Walt. She checked his hands. The tips of 2 fingers on his right hand were a pale, waxy color that she recognized and did not like at all. "Walt," she said carefully, "I need you to tell me the truth. Were you having trouble feeling your hands before you came inside?" He hesitated, which told her the answer. "Some," he said. "How long?" Another hesitation. "Maybe an hour before I came in." She kept her face neutral. Inside, she was doing rapid calculations: duration of cold exposure, the color of the fingertips, the trembling, the overall state of him. "You're going to be all right," she said. And she believed it if they moved correctly, if the warming was gradual, if those fingers came back to their normal color within the next hour. "But you have to let me manage this my way and not argue with me. Can you do that?" "Yes'm," Walt said. Tom arrived with the warm water and the blankets and the ginger. Eleanor directed the process with the kind of focused, deliberate calm she had learned from watching a doctor work once in a town in Nebraska, watching the way he moved through a crisis without haste and without waste. Every action chosen, none of them extra. She got warm water bottles against Walt's core, not his extremities. She got the ginger made into a weak tea that she had him drink slowly, 2 sips at a time. She kept the warming gradual. That was the thing people always got wrong, rushing to heat up someone who was hypothermic, which could send the blood rushing back to the extremities too fast and stop the heart. She sat beside Walt's bunk for 40 minutes. At the end of 40 minutes, the trembling had eased to intermittent shuddering. The fingers were showing the first pink of returning circulation. His lips had gone from blue to their regular chapped tan. Tom Briggs, who had been standing at the foot of the bunk the entire time, let out a long, slow breath. Nathaniel Brooks was there too. He had followed. At some point, she wasn't sure when, and he was standing with his arms crossed and his face in a state that was not quite composed. "Is he going to be all right?" Nathaniel said. His voice was lower than usual. "If he stays warm and still for the rest of today," Eleanor said, "he'll be fine. The fingers concerned me, but they're coming back. He needs to stay off the night watch for at least 2 days." She glanced up at Nathaniel. "He shouldn't have been out there as long as he was." "I know," Nathaniel said. "He's not a young man, and the temperature was already—" "I know, Eleanor." His voice was quiet. "I know." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Walt, who was watching both of them with the particular attentiveness of a man who has been lying sick in bed and has nothing to do but observe the people around him. "Go to sleep, Walt," she said. "Miss Eleanor," Walt said, "I've been watching you work this ranch for 3 years, and I always thought you were the finest cook in Wyoming Territory." He paused to let a shudder pass through him. "Turns out I had that about only half right," She tucked the blanket more firmly around his shoulder. "Sleep," she said. She stood up and walked back into the connecting passage and stood there for a moment in the narrow, cold hallway, with her hand pressed against the wall, just breathing. Behind her, she heard Nathaniel's footsteps. He stopped a few feet away. She did not turn around. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "I owe you a significant apology," he said. "And I'm not going to give it to you standing in a hallway in the middle of a storm, because it deserves better than that. But I need you to know," he paused, "what you did for this ranch yesterday. What you've been doing for this ranch, probably for years, that I didn't see. I need you to know that I see it now." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about 12 years old and the Dakota sky. She thought about the 11 cattle they lost and the family that froze. She thought about 3 years of breakfasts and swept floors and careful invisible competence and the sentence leave weather decisions to people who understand ranching. She thought about Tom saying "yes, ma'am" in the dark of a howling Wyoming night. She thought about Pete's 19-year-old face doing its best to hold an apology. She thought about Walt Morrison's blue lips turning pink. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," she said. She turned around. "Now," she said, "the cattle in the near paddock still need checking, and I need 2 men for that careful men on the rope line. The storm isn't over. We've got at least another 12 hours of this, possibly more." She straightened. "And I need to go start breakfast because your crew has been up all night, and hungry men make bad decisions." Nathaniel Brooks looked at her. For the first time in 3 years, he looked at her the way you look at someone whose opinion you are genuinely interested in. "What do you need?" he said. Eleanor told him. And this time, he listened. Breakfast was eggs and salt pork, and 3 full loaves of bread, and Eleanor cooked it all while standing at a stove that had been burning continuously for 31 hours, and not a single man at that table that morning said a word about the weather being nothing to worry about. They ate fast, and they ate everything. The kind of eating that happens when men have been working in the cold all night and their bodies are demanding payment. Pete cleaned his plate and reached for a second piece of bread before he'd finished the first. Cody poured his own coffee for once without waiting for someone to pour it for him, which Eleanor noted silently as a small sign that the order of things was already shifting in ways nobody had formally announced. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table and ate without speaking, which was unusual for him. He was a man who normally used mealtimes to conduct business, talking through the day's work, assigning tasks, holding court, in the way of a man comfortable with his own authority. This morning, he ate and listened, and watched Eleanor move between the stove and the table, and when she refilled his coffee without being asked, he said thank you in a voice that was quieter than his normal register. Tom caught Eleanor's eye across the table. She looked away first. She had things to do. By 8 in the morning, she had a clear picture of what the day required, and it was not a simple picture. The storm was still going. She could hear it pressing against the north wall with sustained force, punctuated every few minutes by gusts that rattled every window in the house simultaneously. The temperature outside had not risen. The cattle in the near paddock had been checked by Tom and Hector Vale during a brief, manageable stretch between 6 and 6:30, and the news was not good. 2 of the older cows were in serious distress. Tom brought the report to Eleanor rather than directly to Nathaniel, which she noticed and said nothing about. "Bess and the old brindle," Tom said. "Bess is down. The brindle's standing, but she's not right. Wouldn't eat from the feed I brought." "How long have they been without proper shelter?" "They got pushed to the far corner of the paddock during the night. Fence on the east side of the near paddock, the section near the creek bend. It went down sometime between midnight and 4. They couldn't get back to the lean-to." Eleanor set down her dish towel. "Which section of fence?" "East corner, near the creek bend." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The post she had checked was on the north line. The east corner post near the creek bend was a different one she had noted in September as a possible weak point, but had not gotten to before the storm hit. She opened her eyes. "Can we get them moved?" she said. In this wind, getting into the paddock is possible if we run a rope line out to the fence. Getting 2 sick cows moved is a different question. Bess won't walk easy on a good day. She'll walk if she's warm enough to want to, Eleanor said. We need to get heat to her before we try to move her. A bucket of warm mash not too hot, and a blanket if we can keep one on her long enough to matter. If her core temperature is up, she'll follow the feed bucket. She paused, thinking. Who's your strongest with the cattle? Hector, Tom said without hesitation. And Walt? But Walt's? Walt's in his bunk. Hector, then. And you. She picked up her coat. And me. Tom looked at her coat, then at her. You're going into the paddock. I've been in worse. You've been up for going on 30 hours. So have you, she said. Get the rope. Nathaniel had come to the kitchen doorway somewhere in the middle of that exchange, and he stood there long enough to hear the end of it. He did not offer a counter-opinion. He did not tell Eleanor that going into the paddock was ranch business and not her concern. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Tom, and then he said, I'm coming too. Hector Vale said nothing at all, which from Hector was the equivalent of a lengthy endorsement. They went out on the rope line in a chain of 4, Tom first, then Eleanor, then Hector, then Nathaniel at the end. The wind in the gap between the house and the paddock fence was exactly as bad as Eleanor had described to Pete and Cody in the early hours. She felt it try to take her off her feet twice in the first 20 steps, and both times she dropped her weight and held the rope and pushed through. She was aware of Nathaniel's presence at the back of the line in a way she hadn't been aware of him all morning. Not with any particular emotion, just a heightened consciousness of him, the sound of his breathing and his boots through the howl of the wind, the way he moved. She had spent 3 years trying not to be seen by Nathaniel Brooks. She was not sure how she felt about being seen now. Bess was down in the far corner of the paddock exactly as Tom had described, and the sight of her hit Eleanor with a pang of something that went beyond the practical. Bess was the oldest cow on the property. Eleanor didn't know her precise age, but guessed north of 12, and she had a way of watching people with dark, intelligent eyes that Eleanor had always privately liked. She was lying on her side, and she was shivering the way Walt had been shivering, that deep, involuntary trembling that spoke of a body spending more energy staying alive than it had left to spare. "Hey, old girl," Eleanor said. She crouched down beside the cow, the wind tearing at her back, and put her hand on Bess's neck. The hide was cold. Too cold. "Hey, I've got you." She looked up at Hector. "The mash." He had it in a covered bucket. She took the bucket, pried the lid off against the wind, and held it under Bess's nose. The cow's nostrils flared. "That's it," Eleanor said. "There you are. Come on." It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of Eleanor crouched in a Wyoming blizzard with her knees in the frozen mud, and the wind working at every exposed piece of her, talking steadily and quietly to an old cow who had every reason to give up holding that bucket of warm mash under her nose and waiting. Bess lifted her head. Then she started to rise. Hector moved in on one side and Nathaniel moved in on the other, both of them helping her up without being asked, and Eleanor kept the bucket moving, not letting Bess have it yet, keeping it just far enough ahead that the cow would follow. And Bess followed, unsteady, slow shaking, but moving. The brindle cow, watching from 8 feet away, began moving after them without any prompting at all. Tom said very quietly, "I'll be damned." "Language," Eleanor said. She was watching Bess's feet. "Keep her moving." They got both cows into the main barn. It took 22 minutes, and by the end of it, Eleanor's hands had gone past cold into a deep ache that she recognized and ignored. She got Bess into the large stall at the back, got blankets on both animals, got the warm mash bucket in front of Bess, and watched her eat 3 mouthfuls before she finally allowed herself to stand up straight and breathe. Nathaniel was 2 feet behind her. She turned and found him closer than she expected, and she saw in his face an expression that she did not have a ready category for. Not gratitude exactly, not guilt exactly, Something with more depth than either of those, something that suggested he was working through a recalibration of something significant and finding it more difficult than he had anticipated. "Nathaniel." Tom's voice came from the barn door. "You need to come see this." The roof. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. A groan from above that was structural. Not weather. The particular sound of something bearing a load it was not designed to bear. She had been listening to the barn roof for the past hour, with one part of her mind, and had assessed it as stressed but manageable, and now she recalculated rapidly as she looked up at the ceiling of the barn and saw it. The center beam. The snow load on the barn roof had built up over the past 18 hours, past the point where the center beam could manage it with the confidence it had been managing it yesterday. She could see the sag, not large, not catastrophic yet, but there. A deflection of several inches along the beam's midpoint that had not been there the night before. "That beam," she said. "Yep," Tom said. "How old is that barn?" 16 years, Nathaniel said from behind her. "The wood's dry," she said. "Dry wood loses strength faster than green wood under this kind of load." She turned to look at him. "We need to support that beam." "With what?" "The fence posts from the stack near the east wall. We use 3 of them as temporary columns, set them under the beam at intervals. It won't be permanent, but it will redistribute the load enough to keep the beam from failing." She was already moving toward the fence post stack. "Tom, I need you to brace the posts. Hector, you steady the base. Mr. Brooks." "I'll get the posts," Nathaniel said. She stopped, looked at him. In 16 years on this ranch, she would have wagered Nathaniel Brooks had never taken a direct instruction from his cook. He was already moving toward the post stack. She got back to work. It took 35 minutes to get the 3 improvised support columns in place. 3 fence posts standing vertically under the center beam, wedged tight with spare lumber hammered in at the top to create a solid contact. It was rough carpentry. It would not have earned any foreman's approval under normal circumstances. But when Eleanor stood back and watched the beam and waited, and the groan did not come again, she allowed herself one small exhale. "Will it hold?" Hector asked. "Through this storm," she said. "The beam needs to be properly assessed and possibly replaced when the weather breaks. But it'll hold today." Hector looked at the improvised supports for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. Hector Vale was 47 years old, a man of very few words, and even fewer compliments, and he said only one thing. "Good thinking," he said. From Hector, that was a standing ovation. They filed back into the house along the rope line just before 10 in the morning, and Eleanor went directly to the stove and started heating water, because the 4 of them needed to get warm from the inside, before the cold they'd absorbed did what cold did, when you let it sit in the body too long. She made coffee, and she made a weak ginger tea for Hector, who had come in with the beginning of that particular gray tinge around his mouth that she had seen on Walt's face in the small hours, and she pushed both drinks on the men, without asking their preference. Nathaniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and stood near the stove and said nothing for several minutes. Then he said, "Eleanor, how long have you known that beam was at risk?" She thought about it. "I noticed the sag first in early October. It was small. I mentioned it to—" She stopped. "To who?" he said. She met his eyes. "To nobody," she said. "Because it didn't seem like the kind of thing I was supposed to notice." The kitchen went quiet, not the uncomfortable silence of an argument. The heavier silence of a truth that had just taken up space in a room and was now waiting to see how the people in it were going to manage its presence. Tom Briggs set his coffee cup down very carefully. Hector looked at the floor. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and then he looked away. And when he looked back, his jaw was set in a way that she had seen before, on men who were holding something difficult. "How many things," he said slowly, "have you noticed on this ranch, and not said?" "A fair number," she said. "Give me one more." She considered. "The water pipe on the north side of the house. The one that freezes every winter. There's a simple fix, wrap it in burlap and add a second layer of insulation on the outside of the wall. Would take 2 men half a day. You'd never lose water again in a freeze. Nathaniel said nothing. "The gate on the south paddock," she continued. "The latch is wearing. It'll fail in the next 6 months. Better to replace it now than lose cattle through it." She paused. "The roof on the equipment shed has a section of shingles that's been lifting since August. One more hard winter and water's going to get in and ruin whatever's stored underneath." Another pause. "Do you want me to keep going?" He looked at her. "You've been walking around this ranch for 3 years." "Yes." "Noticing things?" "Yes." "And saying nothing." She held his gaze. "I said things," she said carefully, "when the occasion seemed to warrant it. And I learned fairly quickly what occasions those were." The weight of that landed exactly where she intended it to, and she watched it land, and she did not soften it, because she had decided in the small cold hours of this morning that some things needed to stay their full size. Nathaniel set his coffee cup on the table. He put both hands flat on the table surface. He looked at them the way he had looked at them earlier that morning, like a man reviewing a document he had not read carefully enough the first time. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "Right now," Eleanor said, "you owe me a decision on the grain ration and a second person for the afternoon barn check. The rest can wait." He looked up. "Grain ration," she said. "Draft horses down a third hay up. That was my recommendation. Do you agree?" A pause. And then Nathaniel Brooks, owner of Red Hollow Ranch, 22-year veteran of Wyoming ranching, said, "Yes, do it." She picked up her pencil. She wrote it down. The storm did not break that afternoon. Eleanor had not expected it to. She had told Tom that morning she expected another 12 hours at least, and the storm seemed to be honoring that estimate with a kind of grim consistency, maintaining its full force through the noon hour, through the early afternoon, settling into the sustained brutal cold of a blizzard that has found its rhythm and intends to keep it. At 1 in the afternoon, Walt's condition took a turn, not for the worse for the better, sharply and dramatically, and in a way that made Eleanor sit with her eyes closed for a moment in sheer relief. She had gone to check on him at noon, and found him sitting up, color returned to his face, the trembling entirely gone. The fingers were pink. He was annoyed about being confined to bed, which she took as the best possible sign. "I feel fine," he told her. "You feel fine because I've been keeping you warm and still," she said. "You'll feel considerably less fine if you get up too soon, and the blood pressure—" "I know what hypothermia is, Miss Eleanor. I've been in Wyoming for 40 years. "Then you know you stay in that bunk until tomorrow morning," she said. He grumbled. She tucked his blanket. He grumbled some more. "Walt," she said, "do you want me to tell Cody to come in here and keep you company?" "God, no," Walt said immediately. "Boy never stops talking." "Then stay in your bunk and be grateful for the quiet." She was in the hallway, outside his door, pulling the door shut behind her, when she nearly walked into Pete Rawlings. He was standing in the narrow hallway with a look on his face that was different from any expression she had seen from him in 3 years. Not the easy humor of a young man coasting through his days, but something more serious, more considered. "Miss Eleanor," he said, "can I ask you something?" She waited. "How do you know all this stuff?" he said. "The sky, the horses, the beam in the barn. Walt, how do you know all of it?" She looked at him for a moment. "I pay attention," she said. But he struggled with it. "Every man on this ranch pays attention. Tom's been a rancher 30 years. Hector grew up on a cattle operation. Mr. Brooks, they pay attention to what they expect to see," she said. "That's different." She began walking toward the kitchen. He fell into step beside her, which she had not invited, but did not discourage. When you're sure of your own expertise, you see the things that confirm what you already know. You stop seeing the things that don't fit the pattern. She pushed open the kitchen door. "I've never been sure of my expertise here. Nobody's let me be sure of it, so I just kept watching everything." Pete was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't seem fair," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She went to the stove. "But," she said without turning around, "being unseen has its own education. I've learned this ranch from the ground up from every angle without anyone telling me what I was supposed to notice or not notice. There's something to be said for that. She picked up the bread knife. Even if I'd rather have been heard. Pete sat down at the table. You're going to be heard now, he said. She cut the bread. We'll see, she said. The afternoon light was already beginning to fail when the second structural crisis hit, and this one hit without warning. Eleanor was in the main hall, carrying the lamp oil she had relocated from the back room, when she heard the sound, a sharp crack from the direction of the secondary barn. The smaller east side structure followed immediately by a heavy impact that she felt through the floor rather than heard with her ears. She dropped the oil containers on the hall bench and moved. Tom was ahead of her. He had been in the front room and came through the door at a run, and they made eye contact in the hallway in the half-second before they both turned toward the east side of the house. Secondary barn, she said. Heard it, he said. Don't go in yet, she said. If that was a partial collapse. I know, he said. I know. They stopped at the east window. Through the glass in the dim gray light, Eleanor could see that the secondary barn was still standing, but the roof line on the south end was wrong. The pitch was different. Something had come down. South end of the roof, she said. Sections failed. Equipment in there. 2 spare saddles. The emergency rope coil, I moved those out yesterday. But the plow equipment is still in there. And she stopped. Tom looked at her. The winter seed stock, she said. I didn't move it. The silence between them lasted about 2 seconds. How much? Tom said. 2 full crates. Spring wheat and corn. It's enough for... She was calculating rapidly. It's the entire planting stock for next spring's crop. Tom took a breath. If water gets in on it, he said. It won't keep, she said. Not if it freezes and thaws and freezes again. The germination rate drops. By spring it might be worthless. Can we get in there? She looked at the roof line again. The section that had failed was the south end. The seed crates were on the north wall, which was still intact as far as she could tell. Yes, she said. If we go in through the north door, not the south, we should be clear of the collapse zone. Should, Tom said. Should. She agreed. They went to get Nathaniel. He took the situation in with about 10 seconds of very focused listening and then said, Let's go. Hector went too. Cody stayed at the house on Eleanor's instruction to monitor the main barn brazier and the household fires because she was not willing to leave the primary heat sources unwatched. They went on the rope line, all 4 of them moving faster than was strictly comfortable in the wind because the seed stock question had added urgency to a situation that was already urgent. The north door of the secondary barn opened without difficulty. Eleanor went in first, which nobody argued about, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the interior and felt the particular focused calm that came over her in crisis situations, that slowing down of sensation, that narrowing of everything to what was in front of her and what needed to happen. The south end of the roof had come down on the south section. Not a complete collapse, one major rafter had failed and brought part of the roofing material down with it, and the snow that had been sitting on that section was now inside the barn in a heap. The south section equipment was under the snow. The north section was clear. The seed crates were where she had left them against the north wall. Intact. Move them, she said. Both crates to the main barn. Main barn is warmer and the roof is now supported. She was already moving toward the nearest crate. Mr. Brooks, Hector, take that one. Tom, help me with this one. Eleanor, those crates weigh, Nathaniel started. I know what they weigh, she said. He stopped arguing. The crates were heavy. She and Tom managed theirs with the particular ungraceful efficiency of 2 people who are focused entirely on the task and have no attention to spare for anything else. She could feel the strain in her back and her arms, and she filed those sensations away in the part of her mind reserved for things to deal with later, and she kept moving. They got both crates to the main barn. They stacked them against the north wall away from the brazier's direct heat, but in the warmest section of the structure. Eleanor checked the seal on both crates. Both tight. She stood up. Her hands were shaking, not from cold this time, from exertion, and she pressed them flat against the crate lid until they steadied. "The seed's fine," she said. "Both crates are sealed. If we keep them in here through the storm and the temperature in the barn stays above freezing, which it will, as long as the brazier holds, they'll be viable in spring." Nathaniel was breathing hard beside her. He put his hand on top of the crate and kept it there, like a man making sure something real was in front of him. "The crop," he said. "Not to anyone in particular." "It's fine," Eleanor said again. He turned and looked at her. She was a mess. She knew it without needing a mirror, mud on her coat chafe and dust from the barn floor on her skirt. Her hair that had been neat at 4 a.m, long since pulled loose by wind and work-dark shadows under her eyes, from 30-something hours without sleep. She looked exactly like a woman who had spent an entire night and day holding a ranch together with whatever came to hand. Nathaniel Brooks looked at her, and whatever he was seeing was working something in his face that she could not quite read. "Eleanor," he said. Hector coughed suddenly, which in Hector's vocabulary was a form of communication. Eleanor looked at him. "You should know," Hector said, directing his words at a point somewhere between Eleanor and Nathaniel, in the way of a man who has decided to say something and is not entirely comfortable saying it, but is going to say it anyway. "There's been talk in the bunkhouse." "About the storm," Tom said. "About after the storm," Hector said. He looked at Eleanor directly, then for one of the few times in her memory. "About what ought to be different after." She looked back at him. "Walt started it," Hector said, "before he went to bed this morning. Said some things ought to change on this ranch, and that he wasn't going to pretend he didn't see what he saw this past day. Pete agreed. Cody agreed." A pause. "I agreed." Eleanor did not move. "We don't rightly know what that looks like in practice." Hector continued in a tone of a man who has prepared remarks and is delivering them whether anyone likes it or not. "That's for Mr. Brooks to decide. But we wanted it said." She held Hector's gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Hector," she said quietly. He nodded. Once. Then he turned and went to check on Caesar, and the conversation was over, which was the most Hector Vale thing she had ever witnessed. Tom was very carefully not looking at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at the seed crates. Then he straightened up, and he turned to face Eleanor squarely in the way of a man who has been working toward a decision for the past 18 hours and has finally arrived at it. "We need to talk," he said. "When this storm breaks, you and I seriously, about how this ranch is run." He paused. "About your place in it." Eleanor looked at him. 3 years. 3 years of breakfast before dawn and swept floors and careful, invisible competence, and one morning of leave-weather decisions to people who understand ranching. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about all the ways she could say it with distance, with dignity, with the careful grace of a woman who has learned to make herself small. She chose differently. "I'd like that very much," she said. "Mr. Brooks." He nodded. Something settled between them. Not resolved, not simple, but real. The kind of thing that once it has been said changes the shape of every conversation that comes after it. Outside, the storm was still going. Inside the main barn of Red Hollow Ranch, a man and a woman stood on either side of 2 seed crates and 2 sick cows and 3 fence posts, holding up a beam. And around them was the evidence of 30-some hours of work that one of them had done and the other had not seen coming, and the distance between where they had been yesterday morning and where they were standing right now was not a distance you could measure in hours. Eleanor picked up her lantern. "I need to go check on the bread," she said. She walked out of the barn and into the wind, and she held the rope, and she moved forward into the dark with the steady, purposeful stride of a woman who has somewhere to be and knows exactly how to get there. And behind her she heard Nathaniel's footsteps following, and she did not slow down. She did not need to. He was keeping up just fine. The bread was done, and the storm was not. Eleanor pulled the loaves from the oven at 4:30 in the afternoon and set them on the cooling rack and stood there for a moment just breathing in the smell of them, because she had learned years ago that there were small anchors in the middle of hard things, small ordinary moments that reminded the body, It was still in the business of living, and the smell of fresh bread was one of hers. She had been awake for 36 hours. She did not intend to sleep yet. Tom came in from the back passage, stamping snow off his boots, and went directly to the stove without speaking, which Eleanor had come to understand as his way of communicating that things were manageable, but not easy. She poured him coffee, and he took it and drank half of it standing up before he said anything. "Main barn is holding," he said. "The supports are doing what you said they'd do. Brazier's steady. Both sick cows ate their evening feed. Bess is standing." "Good," she said. "Secondary barn is a loss for tonight," he said. "The collapsed section is going to need full assessment when the weather breaks, but it's not spreading. The rest of the structure's stable. The plow equipment that was under the collapse. Buried under snow and debris. Won't know until we dig it out." He paused. "Could be fine. Could be damaged." She nodded and filed that away. "Mr. Brooks is in the front room," Tom said. "He's been there about an hour, just sitting." He looked at her sideways. "He doesn't sit much." Eleanor set the second loaf on the rack. "No," she said. "He doesn't." She knew what Nathaniel was doing, or at least she thought she did, because she had done the same thing herself, plenty of times, sitting with something large and uncomfortable that had arrived unexpectedly, turning it over in her hands, trying to figure out its dimensions. The difference was that Eleanor had been doing that kind of sitting in private in her narrow room for 3 years, and Nathaniel was doing it in his own front room, on his own property, after a day that had dismantled something he had believed about himself and his ranch, and possibly about her. She could afford to let him sit. She had bread to slice and a pot of beans that had been simmering since noon, and 5 men who had not had a proper meal since breakfast. Supper was quieter than breakfast had been. The urgency of the morning had settled into a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that follows sustained adrenaline when the body starts sending notices that it is done, cooperating with whatever the mind has planned. Pete ate with his head slightly forward, and Eleanor could see him fighting sleep between bites. Cody had the blank wide eyes of someone operating well past his limit. Hector ate steadily and without expression as he always did, but he was sitting slightly differently than usual, a small forward lean like a man who has decided he belongs at whatever table he's sitting at in a new way. Walt was still in his bunk. Eleanor had brought him a bowl of beans and half a loaf, and he had eaten all of it and been asleep before she closed the door. Nathaniel came to the table late. He sat down and accepted the bowl she set in front of him, and ate for a few minutes in silence, and then said without looking up, "When did you first know about the storm?" "First light yesterday morning," she said, "before breakfast." "That early. The sky had color in it before the sun was fully up, and the horses had been unsettled since the night before." She sat down across from him with her own bowl, the first proper meal she'd had since yesterday morning. "When those two things happen together in November in Wyoming, it means something." "I've ranched here for 22 years, and I didn't see it," he said. "You weren't looking at the sky," she said. "You were looking at your plans for the day." He looked up at her. "That's not a criticism," she said. "It's just the truth of it. You had business in Laramie. You had the day already arranged in your head before you walked out the door. The sky doesn't fit into an already arranged day, so you don't adjust the day for the sky. You make the sky fit the day." She took a spoonful of beans. "Most people do that. I've never had a day arranged enough to do it, so I watch the sky." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's not entirely a compliment to myself," he said slowly. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." From the other end of the table, Hector made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Not quite. After supper, after the dishes, after Eleanor had checked the fires, and checked the water supply, and checked the temperature in Walt's room, and found him sleeping peacefully and warm. She went to the back room, her back room, the one she had quietly prepared over months, and she sat on the small stool she kept there, and she let herself be still for the first time in 38 hours. Her hands ached. Both wrists ached. Her back was a sustained, dull complaint that she had been successfully ignoring since noon and was no longer able to entirely ignore. She was past tired into a state that had its own specific quality, a kind of luminous exhaustion, where everything seemed very clear and very distant at the same time. She thought about her father. She thought about him standing at the kitchen window on the morning of the big storm in Dakota, looking at that greenish sky going very quiet. She had been 12 years old, and she had not fully understood what she was seeing, only that her father, who was not a man who went quiet, was quiet. It had frightened her more than the sky had. Afterward, after the cattle and the days of digging out and the news from the neighboring homesteads, her father had sat her down and said something she had carried ever since. He had said the land doesn't care what you think you know. The land only cares what you actually know. And the only way to know the land is to listen to it more than you talk. She had been listening ever since. She had been listening on this ranch for 3 years to the horses and the wind and the pipes and the fences and the beam in the barn and the shingles on the equipment shed, and she had been listening to the men too, to the rhythms of how they thought and what they valued, and where the gaps were between what they believed and what was true. She had a lot stored up. She realized, very ready to be asked for it. She stood up, rolled her neck until it cracked in a way that felt like a small mercy, and went back out to check the fires before bed. She found Nathaniel in the hallway. He was holding a lamp, and he had the look of a man who had been intending to go somewhere and had stopped reconsidering. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and then he said, "I was coming to find you." "I'm here," she said. He gestured toward the front room. She followed him. The front room was the warmest room in the house right now. It had the largest fireplace, and Eleanor had been running it at full capacity since the night before. Nathaniel sat in one of the chairs, and she sat across from him, and the fire was between them, and outside, the storm was still making its case against the walls, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation." "What conversation?" she said. "The one where I explain how a man can have someone working for him for 3 years. Someone who knows his land better than he does, who has been protecting things he didn't even know were at risk, who tried to warn him and got told to mind her place and not have seen it." He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the fire. "I keep trying to build an explanation that doesn't make me look like a fool. I'm having trouble." "You're not a fool," Eleanor said. "You're a man who was raised in a world that told you certain people had knowledge worth having and certain people didn't. You followed the map you were given." "The map was wrong." "Yes," she said. "It was." He looked up at her. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he said. "Any of it. The fence, the pipe, the beam. Were you just going to keep watching it and saying nothing?" She considered the question honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I was going to tell you about the beam before winter, but then October got away from me. The fence I had put on my own list to address because—" She stopped. "Because you've been doing ranch maintenance on your own," he said, "on top of the housework. Small things," she said. "Things I could do without needing to be given permission. The burlap on the pipe." She looked at him. "I noticed it in September," he said quietly. "I couldn't figure out when it had been done or who had done it. I asked Tom. Tom didn't know." He looked at the fire. "I should have followed that question further." "Yes," she said. "You should have." Another silence. This one was different from the ones before. It not uncomfortable, not charged with unresolved tension, but thoughtful. The silence of two people who have gotten to the place in a conversation where pretense is no longer practical. "I want to make you a different offer," Nathaniel said, "than what you have now." Eleanor waited. "Not just more responsibilities," he said carefully. "Because that's not what I mean. I mean something with authority behind it. Real authority. The kind that means when you say the fence post needs replacing, it gets replaced. When you say the storm is coming, people listen." He paused. "I'd need to think carefully about how to structure it. I'd want your input on that, which is a sentence I recognize I should have been saying 3 years ago. But the principle of it, I'm certain of the principle of it." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it would mean, the practicalities of it, the men's reactions, some of them, the neighboring ranchers, the people in town who had a fixed and comfortable idea of what Eleanor Hayes was. She thought about something else too, something more personal, something she had been careful not to let herself look at directly in a long time. She was 31 years old, and she had spent 6 of those years in service positions on other people's property, doing the invisible work that kept things running, and she was very good at it, and she was very tired of it being invisible. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "If the storm hadn't happened," she said, "if yesterday had been an ordinary day, would this conversation be happening?" He did not answer immediately. She respected him for that. A faster answer would have been a less honest one. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'd like to think I would have gotten there eventually, but—" He stopped. "Probably not soon." "That's an honest answer," she said. "It's the only one I've got." She looked at the fire for a moment. "Then I'm glad the storm happened," she said. "Even though it was a miserable 2 days and I haven't slept and my back feels like I've been hauling fence posts, which I have been." She looked back at him. "I'm glad it happened." He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she had caught at breakfast, the one that didn't quite complete itself. It was a more interesting expression than a full smile, she thought. More honest, more uncertain. It had the quality of a thing that was still becoming, rather than a thing that had already arrived. "Get some sleep," he said. "We can finish this when the storm breaks." She stood up. "I'll check the fires first." "Eleanor." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. "For what it's worth, and I know it's late in coming, and I know that doesn't make it worth more than it is what you've done for this ranch in the last 2 days is the most important thing anyone has done here in a long time, possibly ever." He met her eyes. "I see it." She held his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," she said. "Nathaniel," he said. She paused. In 3 years, she had never called him by his first name. It was not done. It was not the kind of thing that happened between a ranch owner and his cook in Wyoming Territory in 1884. "Good night," she said. "Nathaniel." She went and checked the fires. She slept for 4 hours, which was not enough and was more than she had expected, and she woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of silence. Real silence. She lay still for a moment, listening to it, and then she understood what had changed. The wind had stopped. Not eased, stopped. The sustained pressure against the walls that had been the constant background noise of the past 30-odd hours was simply gone, and in its absence the house sounded enormous and very quiet. She got up. She went to the window. Through the glass she could see the sky, not black with cloud, but a deep, clear Wyoming blue, and stars, more stars than she had seen in 2 days, an extravagance of stars like the sky was making up for lost time. The storm had broken. She stood at the window for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she put on her coat and went to start the coffee. She was not the only one who had noticed. Tom was in the kitchen before the coffee finished with the alert look of a man whose body had registered the change in sound even through sleep. He went to the window, looked out, made a sound of pure relief that he immediately tried to suppress. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. "Temperature's still going to be bad for a day or 2. "Yes, but the wind's gone and the snow's stopped. That's the critical part." He turned from the window. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way you look at someone after a shared ordeal, when the ordeal is over, and you're both standing there still intact, and that fact is itself remarkable. "How are you?" he said. She considered the question. "Tired," she said. "Relieved. My back hurts." She poured 2 cups of coffee. "And I believe Bess is going to be fine, which I'm more relieved about than I expected to be." "Bess?" Tom said with the slight warmth he reserved for the things he actually cared about. "She's a good cow," Eleanor said. "She is," Tom agreed. The morning came in bright and brutal, the kind of Wyoming winter morning that follows a major storm with sunlight hitting fresh snow at an angle that made everything look like it was made of light. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway for 30 seconds and let it hit her face and did not feel apologetic about the 30 seconds. Then she turned around and started making breakfast. By the time the men were up and eating, the damage assessment had already begun, in the way it does on ranches. Informally, incrementally, men going out in pairs and coming back with reports. The tone of those reports was better than Eleanor had feared, and better, she suspected, than it would have been on most neighboring properties. The main barn was structurally sound. The improvised supports had held, and the center beam had survived without additional deflection. The fence sections that had failed could be repaired. The secondary barn's collapsed section was contained, and the rest of the structure was salvageable. The cattle losses were zero. The horses were unhurt. The seed stock was intact. Walt came out of the bunkhouse under his own power, mid-morning, moving carefully with the slightly formal dignity of a man who has been laid low and wants to demonstrate that the situation has been fully resolved. He came to the kitchen and sat down and accepted coffee from Eleanor and said, "Heard the damage report." "And," she said, "and I've been on this range for 12 years, he said, "and I've never seen a ranch come through a storm like that as clean as we did." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Not by chance." "No," Eleanor said. "Tom told me what you did," Walt said. "All of it. The rope line, the crates, the beam bess." He paused. "He told me about going out in the paddock in that wind." "Tom went out too," she said. "Tom didn't think of the warm mash," Walt said. "Tom didn't know to use it." He looked at her directly. "I owe you considerably more than you owe me, Miss Eleanor, and I intend to say so to anyone who asks." She set his coffee down in front of him. "You sat up all night on watch," she said, "and you paid for it. We're even." He shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "We are not anywhere close to even." The first visitors arrived that afternoon. Eleanor heard the horses, 3 of them working through the packed snow on the main road with the particular labored sound of animals in deep drifts, before anyone else registered them. She went to the front window and looked out, and saw 3 men on horseback, coming up the approach road, moving with the urgency of people who have someplace specific to be. She did not recognize the horses. She went to find Nathaniel. He was in the front room going over a damage list with Tom when she came to the door and said, "You've got riders coming up the approach road, 3 of them. I don't recognize the horses." Nathaniel and Tom both looked up. "Colors," Nathaniel said. "Gray a roan and a dark bay. The gray has a white sock on the near foreleg." Tom said, "That's Clarence Alderman's gray." Nathaniel was already on his feet. Clarence Alderman was the owner of Cottonwood Ridge, the largest cattle operation in the valley, 3 times the size of Red Hollow, with a foreman and 6 full-time hands, and enough political weight in the county that his opinion on most things was treated as something closer to fact. Eleanor had seen him twice in 3 years, both times at Nathaniel's table, both times holding court in the way of a man accustomed to being the most significant person in any given room. He came through the front door now with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that Eleanor had never seen there before. He looked shaken. "Nathaniel," he said. He shook Nathaniel's hand with both of his. "Hell of a storm." "Hell of a storm," Nathaniel agreed. "Come in out of the cold, Clarence. All of you. Eleanor." "Coffee's coming," she said. She was already heading to the kitchen. She could hear the conversation from the kitchen, and she was not pretending that she wasn't listening. Alderman and his 2 companions, she recognized one as his foreman. A man named Grissom had come through the storm badly. 15 cattle dead in the north pasture, where a fence section had failed, and they'd gotten into a cut where drifting snow had buried them before anyone knew they were there. The equipment barn roof had fully collapsed. One of the hands had broken 2 fingers in the collapse, and another had taken a bad fall on the ice and was uncertain whether his ankle was broken or badly sprained. "We've got a man who knows setting bones," Nathaniel was saying when Eleanor came back with the coffee tray. "He can ride over if—" "That'd be appreciated," Alderman said. He accepted the coffee Eleanor handed him without looking at her, then did a second take and looked at her properly in the way people sometimes did when they were surprised to see a face where they expected only service. "Thank you, ma'am." "Of course," she said. She began to withdraw. "How'd you come through?" Alderman asked Nathaniel. Better than expected, Nathaniel said. No cattle losses. Horses are fine. Secondary barn took some roof damage, but the structure held. Alderman stared at him. No cattle. None. I lost 15, Alderman said. His voice had the flat quality of a man who has not yet fully absorbed a number. 15 head. Patterson lost 12. Heard that Dawson's place took roof damage on the main barn. Cattle got out in the night, and they found 3 frozen in the morning. The room was quiet. Grissom the foreman had been looking around the room with the quiet professional habit of a man who assesses things for a living. He said, "What'd you do different?" Nathaniel paused. Eleanor, who was standing near the doorway with the empty tray, felt his pause. "We prepared," Nathaniel said. "Everybody prepares for winter," Grissom said. "We prepared for this specific storm," Nathaniel said, "before it hit." Another pause. Eleanor saw it coming, the day before. She read the signs in the sky and the horses' behavior, and she started moving supplies and reinforcing the structures before any of us were paying attention. There was a silence. Alderman turned and looked at Eleanor. Not the brief, incurious glance he'd given her when she handed him his coffee. A real look, the kind that took its time. "Your cook," he said. To Nathaniel, not to her. Nathaniel stopped. He seemed to be choosing a word and finding that the available words were insufficient. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, finally, as though the name was itself an adequate description. "She's been on this ranch 3 years. Alderman looked at Eleanor for another moment. Then he said directly to her, which she had not anticipated. "You saw this storm coming a full day out." "Yes," she said. "How?" She told him. Concisely, the way she had learned to speak to men who were deciding whether she was worth listening to. No preamble, no hedging, just the specific observations in the specific order she had made them. The sky color and its particular meaning. The horse behavior and what it indicated. The way the temperature had been dropping in the hours before dawn, in a pattern that was different from ordinary November cold. Alderman listened. He was, she realized, a better listener than she would have expected. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My foreman's been with me 15 years. You're telling me you know something he doesn't know." "I'm telling you what I saw," Eleanor said. "What your foreman knows or doesn't know, I couldn't say." Grissom, to his credit, said, "She's right, Mr. Alderman. I didn't see it. I should have." Another silence. Alderman turned back to Nathaniel. "I'd like to talk to you about something," he said. "Not today. When things are settled. But—" He glanced at Eleanor again. "You should have that conversation too, Miss Hayes." She held his gaze. "I'll be here," she said. After Alderman and his men left with Tom riding back with them to attend to the injured hand, the ranch house settled into the particular quiet of a place that has been at high intensity for 2 days and is now allowing itself to exhale. Pete and Cody went out to assess the east fence line and came back with a damage report that was by any measure good news. Hector spent the afternoon in the main barn with the horses, which was where Hector was happiest and where Eleanor did not need to check on him. Walt sat in the kitchen for an hour in the afternoon, not because he needed anything, but because Eleanor suspected the kitchen was warm, and he found her presence easier to be around than he would probably admit to anyone directly. She did not mind. She was making the bread for the next day, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm of it, the kneading, the turning. The rest, and Walt sat with his coffee, and they talked in the intermittent way of two people who do not need to fill silence. And what they talked about was various and ordinary, and had nothing to do with storms or beams or blizzards or what any of it meant. It was the most peaceful hour Eleanor had had in 2 days. She was punching down the risen dough for the second time when Walt said without any particular lead-up, "You know Alderman's going to talk." She did not look up from the bread. "About what?" "About what happened here. About what you did. Alderman doesn't keep quiet about things that affect his operation, and that storm affected his operation considerably." Walt drank his coffee. "He's going to talk to Patterson and Dawson and the rest of them. He's going to say that Nathaniel Brooks came through the storm clean, and the reason was the woman in his kitchen." She turned the dough. And, she said, and by spring, Walt said, people are going to have opinions about that. She looked at him. They already have opinions about me, she said. They've had opinions about me for 3 years. The opinions have just been about different things. These'll be louder, Walt said. Probably, she agreed. You're not worried. She considered it genuinely. I've spent 3 years being worried about being too visible, she said. About saying too much, about stepping past where I was supposed to be, about what people would say if they noticed me noticing things. She pressed her palm into the dough and felt it give and spring back the way good bread dough does when it's right. I'm tired of that kind of worried. If people are going to talk, I'd rather give them something true to say. Walt looked at her for a long moment. Your father teach you that? He said. She looked up, surprised. You mentioned him, Walt said. To Pete, I think. In the hall. I heard it. He taught me to listen to the land, she said. The rest I worked out myself. He'd be proud, Walt said simply. She pressed her hands into the bread and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that wouldn't take more than she had to spare at the moment, and Walt understood that, and he drank his coffee and let it stand. Nathaniel found her in the kitchen at dusk. The bread was in the oven, and the beans were on, and the kitchen was warm, in the way a kitchen gets when something has been baking for an hour. And Eleanor was sitting at the table for the first time all day with a cup of tea, and the inventory list she had been keeping since yesterday morning, going over it for gaps for things that needed restocking for the running total of what the storm had cost and what they had preserved. He sat down across from her. She did not put the list away. He did not ask her to. Alderman said something to me on his way out, Nathaniel said. He said he wanted to know how this ranch prepared while his didn't. He wants to come back in a week and have a longer conversation. He paused. He was looking at you when he said it. I know, Eleanor said. He's going to ask you questions about ranch management, Nathaniel said. About weather reading, about preparation protocols, about things that I have been making decisions about for 22 years that you apparently understand better than I do in some significant areas. She set down her pencil. Not better, she said carefully. Differently. You know things I don't know. You know how to run a cattle drive and how to negotiate with buyers and how to manage a crew of men in ways that I have no experience with. What I know is... She thought about how to say it. What I know is the parts that nobody was watching while the more important things were being done. Those parts nearly sank us, he said, in a 2-day storm. Without the pipe preparation, we'd have lost water. Without the rope line, someone could have been lost in the dark. Without the seed crates. But we didn't lose those things, she said. We're sitting here with bread in the oven and all the cattle alive and Walt's fingers back to their normal color. The parts held. She met his eyes. This time. Next time, he said. Next time, they should hold from the beginning, she said. Not because someone spent 2 days quietly preparing for a storm that nobody believed was coming, but because the preparation is already done. Because the pipe is insulated, and the fence posts are checked, and the beam is replaced, and the protocol for a major weather event is written down somewhere, and everyone on this ranch knows what it is. She paused. Including me. Nathaniel was watching her with an expression that had several things in it simultaneously. Including you officially, he said. Yes, she said. Officially. He put his elbows on the table. I've been thinking about how to structure it, he said. I talked to Tom this afternoon. He had thoughts. What did he say? He said, and I'm quoting him fairly closely, that you've been functioning as the ranch's second foreman for at least 2 years without the title, the authority, or the pay, and that continuing to not address that situation is the kind of thing that tends to resolve itself in ways that are worse than addressing it directly. Eleanor looked at the fire for a moment. Tom said that, she said. Tom is more perceptive than he allows people to know, Nathaniel said. Yes, she agreed. He is. So, Nathaniel said. He put his hands flat on the table, That gesture she had seen twice now. The one that meant he was about to say something he had committed to. "I'd like to offer you a formal position, not a restructured version of what you have. Something new. Operations manager, for want of a better term. Responsible for the ranch's physical infrastructure preparation, supply management, and the things you have apparently already been managing for 2 years, without anyone calling it that." He paused. "With commensurate authority and pay, and a place at the table when decisions about this ranch are made." Eleanor did not respond immediately. She thought about 3 years of breakfast before dawn and swept floors. She thought about the water pipe wrapped in burlap in September, and no one asking who had done it. She thought about standing at the kitchen window, watching a greenish-yellow sky, and knowing what it meant, and turning back to the stove anyway, because there was still food to cook, and no one was going to do it while she was standing at the window. She thought about Nathaniel saying, "Leave weather decisions to people who understand ranching." She thought about Nathaniel saying, "What's your recommendation?" The distance between those two sentences was not a small distance. "There will be pushback," she said. "Yes," he said. "From some of the men. From people in town. Alderman might support it. I think he will actually, because Alderman is practical, but others won't." "Yes," he said again. "It won't be simple," she said. "And it won't be fast. You'll have to hold that line when people push back, and some of them will push back more than once." He met her eyes. "I'm aware of that." "Are you?" she said, not combatively, just directly. "Because it's easier to offer a thing in the aftermath of a crisis than to defend it 6 months later when the crisis is over and people have gone back to their opinions about what's appropriate and what isn't." He held her gaze without flinching. "Eleanor," he said, "I told you about the beam in October, and I can't get that out of my head. You noticed a structural failure on my ranch 2 months before the storm that could have brought my barn down on my horses and my men, and you said nothing because you had learned that saying things didn't lead anywhere useful." He paused. "I don't intend to be the kind of man who lets that happen twice." The fire crackled. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and still and brutally cold, the kind of cold that followed a blizzard when the sky had scrubbed itself empty and the stars were very far away and very bright. Eleanor picked up her pencil. She looked at the inventory list. She looked at Nathaniel Brooks sitting across from her in the kitchen she had run for 3 years, the kitchen where she had made 10,000 breakfasts, where she had stored the water and organized the shelves and kept the books of things she noticed and said nothing about. And she thought that this moment was not the end of anything. It was the start of something considerably harder. She was ready for it. "I have conditions," she said. Nathaniel almost smiled. "I expected you might. The pipe gets insulated before the next freeze. Properly with the right materials, not just burlap. I'll specify what's needed. The east fence corner gets repaired in the first week. The ground is workable in spring. The beam in the barn gets replaced before next winter by a carpenter who knows what he's doing, not improvised fence posts." She looked up from the list. "And I want it in writing. Not because I don't trust your word, but because written things outlast intentions." He nodded. "Done." "And I'd like my name on the supply orders," she said. "When we send to town for materials. My name as the authorizing party." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him absorb the weight of that one, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was specific. It was a flag in the ground. It was visible in a way the other things weren't. "Done," he said. She set the pencil down. "Then we have an agreement," she said. He reached across the table and extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment. She shook it. His grip was firm and unhesitating, and it lasted exactly as long as a handshake between two people who are taking something seriously should last. "Good," he said. She stood up and went to check on the bread. "Eleanor," he said from where he was still sitting. She looked back. "I know this doesn't undo 3 years," he said. "I'm not saying it does." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She turned back to the oven. "But it's a place to start." The bread was golden and done. She pulled it from the oven and set it on the rack and stood there while the kitchen filled with the smell of it, and she thought that some things were small and some things were large, and sometimes you couldn't tell which was which until later, and the only thing to do in the meantime was the work in front of you, and do it well, and wait for the kind of morning that came after the worst storm had finally blown through. That morning was coming. She could feel it the way she felt weather not in any single sign, but in the accumulation of everything she had been watching. She picked up her inventory list and her pencil. She had a great deal to write down. The inventory list filled 4 pages by the time Eleanor set her pencil down that night. She had written everything, not just what the storm had cost them, not just what needed to be repaired or restocked, but the larger list. The one she had been composing in her head for 3 years without ever putting to paper, because there had been no point in putting it to paper when no one was going to read it. The pipe insulation specifications, the fence post replacement schedule, the barn beam measurements and the grade of lumber that would be needed, the supply rotation system for the pantry that would prevent the situation where they had been 2 days from running short on lamp oil, the cattle check protocol for severe weather, the rope line anchor points that should be made permanent rather than improvised each time they were needed. She wrote until her hand cramped. Then she put the list in the back room, her back room, though she was already beginning to think of it differently, less as a private refuge and more as a working office, and she went to bed and slept for 9 hours without moving. She woke to sunlight, real sunlight, not the gray suggestion of it through storm cloud, but the hard, bright winter sun of a Wyoming morning after a blizzard, the kind that turned the snow into something that looked almost valuable. She lay still for a moment and listened to the sound of the ranchmen's voices outside, the movement of horses, the particular creak of the main barn door that she had been meaning to note on her list and now had noted. Normal sounds, working sounds, the sound of a ranch that was still standing and had things to do. She got up and made breakfast. It was the same breakfast she had made every morning for 3 years more or less. Egg, salt pork, coffee, bread from yesterday's baking, and she made it with the same hands and stood at the same stove and rang the same bell. But when the men came in and sat down, something in the room was different in a way that everyone could feel, and no one was going to comment on directly, because that was not how men on a Wyoming ranch in 1884 handled change. They handled it by sitting down in slightly different configurations and speaking slightly differently, and treating certain things as understood that had not been understood the day before. Pete poured his own coffee and then looked at Eleanor's cup and poured hers too. She had not asked him to. He had not made a production of it. He just did it. That was how it started. 3 days after the storm, Clarence Alderman rode back. He came alone this time, which Eleanor took as deliberate a different kind of visit than the first one, when he'd arrived with his foreman and his disaster and his barely concealed shock at finding Nathaniel Brooks's ranch intact. He came in the late morning, tied his horse at the post, and knocked at the front door, rather than riding to the barn, which was also deliberate. Eleanor answered the door. Alderman looked at her for a moment. He was a large man, thick through the chest with a white mustache and the kind of face that had spent 60 years deciding things. He had the bearing of a man accustomed to people adjusting themselves to accommodate him, and standing on Eleanor Hayes's front porch, in the wake of losing 15 cattle. He looked not smaller exactly, but rearranged, like a man who has had to sit with something that didn't fit his previous understanding of how things worked, and had been sitting with it long enough that it had changed his posture slightly. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Mr. Alderman," she said. "Come in, coffee's fresh." She brought him and Nathaniel coffee, and then when Alderman said, "I was hoping Miss Hayes might join us," she sat down. She had been ready for this conversation. She had a copy of the inventory list with her, not the private 4-page version, but a condensed working summary she had prepared the night before in the way she always prepared for conversations that mattered, which was to do the work beforehand and know exactly what she was carrying into the room. Alderman asked his questions carefully and listened to the answers completely, which she respected. He asked about the storm preparation, the specific timing, the specific decisions in what order and why. He asked about the horse behavior and what exactly she had observed and what it meant. He asked about the structural assessments she had made, the beam, the fence, the overhang, and how she had known what to look for. She answered everything directly and without embellishment, the way she had answered his first questions 3 days ago. Halfway through, Alderman set his coffee cup down and said, "My foreman Grissom has been with me 15 years. He's a good man. He knows cattle, and he knows men, and he knows weather well enough to have kept my operation running through 20 Wyoming winters." He paused. "But he didn't see what you saw. And I need to understand why." "Because he was watching for what he knew to watch for," Eleanor said. "He knew the storm was possible. He didn't know it was certain. There's a difference in what you do depending on which of those you believe." "And you believed it was certain." "I'd seen that sky before," she said. "Once, when I was 12 years old in Dakota. It cost my father 11 cattle and could have cost us more." She looked at Alderman steadily. "When you've seen a thing cost you that much, you don't argue with it the second time." Alderman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to ask you something that might seem forward, and I want you to take it in the spirit it's offered." She waited. "Nathaniel tells me he's restructuring your position here," Alderman said. "Operations manager, which is a reasonable thing to call what you've apparently been doing for 3 years without the title." He looked at her. "I'd like to offer you a consulting arrangement with Cottonwood Ridge. Periodic visits monthly or quarterly, whatever is practical to assess our preparation protocols and identify what we're not seeing." He paused. "I don't want to lose another 15 cattle." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor was aware of Nathaniel very still beside her. She looked at Alderman. "That would depend," she said, "on Nathaniel." "It would be your decision," Nathaniel said. His voice was even. "Your expertise, your time. The arrangement here wouldn't prevent it." She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that he meant it, and the fact that he meant it said something significant about how far they had traveled in 3 days, that he was sitting here in his own kitchen, actively not claiming ownership over her knowledge and her labor, which was a more revolutionary act than it probably appeared to Alderman. "Then yes," she said to Alderman. "I'd be willing to discuss it." Alderman nodded once with the solid finality of a man who has gotten what he came for. "Good," he said. He stood, put his hat back on, looked at Nathaniel. "You've got something valuable here, Brooks. More valuable than you knew." He glanced at Eleanor. "More valuable than you let yourself know, I'd wager." He said it without accusation, just plainly as a fact. Nathaniel said yes. After Alderman left, the house was quiet for a moment. Then Nathaniel said, "Monthly visits to Cottonwood Ridge." He said it without any particular inflection, but she heard the thing underneath it. "It doesn't change what we agreed," she said. "No," he said. "I know it doesn't." "But," she said. He looked at her. "No, but," he said. "I was going to say it's the right thing. Alderman lost 15 cattle. Patterson lost 12. Dawson lost 3. If you can prevent that from happening again, that's—" He paused, and something in his face did the thing she had been watching it do for 3 days now. That process of revision that had not finished yet, and might not finish for a long time. "That's more important than keeping you entirely to ourselves." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a generous thing to say," she said. "It's a true thing," he said. She picked up the inventory list. "The pipe?" she said. "I want it done this week before the next freeze." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The pipe was done by Thursday. She supervised it herself, which meant she stood in the cold with her arms crossed, and told Cody twice that he had the burlap on wrong, and needed to rewrap it, and Cody rewrapped it without arguing, which was itself a small revolution. She wrote it on the list when it was done. Pipe insulated, north exterior. Completed Thursday, November 15th, 1884. C. Marsh and P. Rawlings materials per specification, and the act of writing it down, of making it a record, gave her a satisfaction that was quiet and complete. She had started keeping a ranch log, not just the supply inventory, a proper operational log, dated specific recording what had been assessed, and what had been repaired, and what was scheduled, and what was still outstanding. She had been keeping it for 6 years in her own head, and now she was putting it on paper in a leather-bound book that Nathaniel had brought from his desk without being asked, setting it on the kitchen table in the morning and saying only, "Thought you might want this," and she had picked it up and said thank you and begun. The log became the mechanism of everything, because what happened over the following weeks was not a dramatic transformation. It was not one morning where everything was suddenly different. It was incremental, and it was sometimes uncomfortable, and there were days when she felt the resistance in the room like a weather front she hadn't predicted. Hector accepted the new order of things because Hector was fundamentally practical, and the evidence was conclusive. Walt accepted it because Walt had been accepting it since the night he woke up with blue lips and found her crouched beside him, knowing exactly what to do. Pete accepted it with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a young man who has recently discovered that the thing he'd been wrong about had been wrong in an interesting direction. Cody took the longest, not from malice, but from the particular stubbornness of someone who learns by needing to see a thing work before he believes in it. And she was patient with him, because she had always been patient with that kind of person, and because she understood that it was not personal. It was not about her. It was about the order of things, as he had understood it, and the order of things was asking him to update itself, which took time. Tom had accepted it before the storm even ended, and his acceptance mattered in ways he probably did not fully see, because Tom was the kind of man other men watched for cues about what the situation was, and when Tom deferred to Eleanor's judgment without making it a production, it gave everyone else permission to do the same. 3 weeks after the storm, 2 things happened on the same day. The first was that a letter arrived from Alderman confirming the consulting arrangement in writing quarterly visits beginning in February, with the fee he was prepared to pay, written in a clear hand at the bottom. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at the number for a moment before folding it precisely and putting it in the log. The second thing was that a man named Gerald Pryor rode up to Red Hollow Ranch from his property 12 miles north. Eleanor did not know Gerald Pryor. She knew of him a rancher of middle size and long tenure in the valley, the kind of man who had been here long enough that his opinions were treated as a form of local history. He arrived mid-afternoon with the air of a man who had made a decision about something and was not entirely certain how the decision was going to land. Nathaniel brought him to the kitchen. Pryor looked at Eleanor with an expression she had seen before. Not hostility exactly, but the particular wariness of someone confronting something that doesn't fit neatly into his catalog. "This is Eleanor Hayes," Nathaniel said. "She'll be sitting in." Pryor looked at Nathaniel. "Your cook," he said. "My operations manager," Nathaniel said, without hesitation, without qualification. Just that flat and clear. Pryor looked at Eleanor again. She met his eyes. "Mr. Pryor," she said. "Can I get you coffee?" He sat down. She got him coffee. Pryor had come because he'd heard from Alderman, and he'd heard from Patterson, and he'd done the arithmetic on what it meant that Red Hollow had come through the November storm with no cattle losses, while his own operation had lost 8 head and a section of fence that was going to cost him considerably to replace in the spring. He was a proud man, and pride had kept him from coming sooner, but practical had beaten out proud, which in Eleanor's experience was generally how that went when the numbers were clear enough. "I want to know what I should be looking at," he said. He said it to Nathaniel, but his eyes slid to Eleanor as he said it. "You should ask Eleanor," Nathaniel said. Pryor looked at her fully then. She had her log open. She had her pencil. She was 31 years old, and she was sitting at a kitchen table in Wyoming territory, and a man who had been ranching for 30 years had just been directed by her employer to ask her his questions, and she could feel the weight of that moment, and she was not going to let herself get lost in it. "Tell me about your north fence line," she said, "and start from the creek." Pryor talked. She listened, and she wrote, and she asked questions that were specific and practical, and Pryor answered them with increasing directness as the conversation went on, because the questions were good questions, and he was smart enough to know good questions when he heard them. An hour into the conversation, he had stopped directing his answers at Nathaniel and was directing them at Eleanor, and he had not noticed the shift, and she did not point it out. When he left, he shook her hand. It was not something men in Wyoming in 1884 typically did, with a woman who had been introduced to them as a ranch cook 3 months prior. He did it without thinking about it, which she thought was the best way for that kind of thing to happen. December came in hard, but without another major storm, and Eleanor spent the month doing what she had been doing in her head for 3 years and could now do on paper with authority. She walked the full fence line in sections over 2 weeks, logging every weak post, every worn wire, every gate latch that was reaching the end of its useful life. She inspected the equipment shed roof and confirmed her September assessment. The shingles needed replacement on the south section before the next heavy snow, and she scheduled it for the first clear week in January. She ordered supplies from town under her own name as agreed, and received a look from the supply clerk that she acknowledged with a pleasant nod and nothing further. She began quietly to train Cody. Not formally, not with any announcement. She simply started explaining things when he was nearby, why she was checking, what she was checking, what the signs meant, what the response should be. Cody was 20 years old and had more natural ability than he had been given credit for, she thought, and he responded to being treated as someone worth teaching, the way most people respond to that treatment, which was by trying to deserve it. By the 3rd week of December, Cody had started bringing things to her. "Miss Eleanor, that corner post on the east paddock, the one you fixed in the storm, the wire wrap's coming loose." She went to look at it. He was right. "Good eye," she said. He stood slightly straighter for the rest of the day. The first time she attended a meeting with Nathaniel and the 2 other ranch owners from the east end of the valley, she brought the log. She set it on the table without ceremony. The 2 other men brothers named Harlan and Fletcher Tate, who ran adjoining operations and had a combined total of 4 decades of Wyoming ranching between them, looked at the log, then at her, then at Nathaniel, then back at her. Harlan Tate said, "Nathaniel is this. Eleanor Hayes," Nathaniel said. "Operations manager at Red Hollow. She'll be speaking to the preparation assessment." Fletcher Tate had gray eyebrows, the kind that moved expressively and independently from the rest of his face. They went up. Eleanor opened the log to the section she had prepared for this meeting. "The first thing I'd like to discuss," she said, "is the water supply situation across the 3 operations, because based on what I understand of your pipe configurations, all 3 of us are working with the same vulnerability we almost lost our water supply to in November." She laid out the pipe insulation specifications. She had drawn a simple diagram in the log, clear unlabored, showing the wrapping technique and the material quantities by linear foot. Harlan Tate looked at the diagram. He picked up the log, which she had not specifically invited him to do, and looked at it more closely. "You drew this," he said. "Yes," she said. "How long did it take you?" "About 20 minutes," she said. He set the log down. He looked at Fletcher. Something passed between them in the particular wordless language of brothers who have been working together for a long time. Then Harlan Tate looked at Eleanor and said, "We've been meaning to address the pipe situation for 3 winters. Most people have been meaning to," she said. "The difficulty is that it's easy to postpone until it becomes urgent, and when it becomes urgent, it's usually also 30 below, and the pipes are already frozen." She turned to the next page of the log. "Which is why I have a schedule, if it helps." It helped. The meeting ran 2 hours and covered more ground than Eleanor suspected. Most of Nathaniel's meetings with these men had covered, and at the end of it, Fletcher Tate said to Nathaniel, "Where'd you find her?" "She found me," Nathaniel said. Fletcher considered this. "She's been here 3 years." "Yes." "And you're only now." He stopped. The eyebrows rose again. "Yes," Nathaniel said. It was a simple acknowledgement, and it cost him something, and he paid it without flinching, which Eleanor thought was the right thing, and was glad he did it. She was closing the log when Harlan Tate put his hand on the cover briefly. "Could I borrow this?" he said. "The protocol section. I'd like Glenwood to see it." Glenwood was his own foreman. "I'll have a copy made," she said. January brought the cold down hard and clean without another storm, and in the absence of emergency, Red Hollow Ranch settled into a new rhythm that was built on something sturdier than it had been built on before. Eleanor's name was on the supply orders. Eleanor's log sat on the table in the kitchen, which had been the invisible center of the ranch's operations for 3 years and was now the acknowledged center of them. Men from neighboring ranches rode over once, twice, 3 times sometimes to talk to Nathaniel, sometimes specifically to talk to Eleanor, which was a thing that had not happened in the history of this ranch and which Eleanor took note of without making a production of. Walt told her in mid-January that people in town were talking about her. "What are they saying?" she said. "Mostly good things," he said. "Mostly. There are some who think it's irregular." "Irregular," she repeated. "You know how people are," Walt said with the tone of a man who knows perfectly well how people are and doesn't entirely excuse it. "A woman running the operations of a cattle ranch. It's new." "It's only new to the people who weren't here during the storm," she said. "Most people weren't here during the storm," Walt said. "No," she agreed. "So they'll need more time." She was not wrong about that, and she was not particularly troubled by it, which surprised her somewhat when she thought about it. She had spent so many years worried about being seen wrongly, seen too clearly, seen in ways that would cost her. And now she was being seen visibly and by name, and it was uncomfortable in some quarters, and she did not care as much as she had expected to. The worrying had worn thin. She had come out the other side of that long, careful, invisible season of her life, and she was standing in a kitchen with her name on supply orders and her log on the table, and Nathaniel Brooks across from her asking her what she thought, and the worrying felt from this side like a coat she no longer needed to wear. February arrived, and with it, the first consulting visit to Cottonwood Ridge. Eleanor rode over on a Tuesday morning on the roan mare Nathaniel had given her full use of the roan 3 weeks earlier, saying only that it seemed practical, which it was, and she spent 5 hours walking Alderman's property with Grissom at her side, logging what she saw, asking her questions. Grissom was a good man. She had assessed this at their first meeting, and the assessment held. He was not threatened by her, which she had been uncertain about and had prepared for. She had thought through what she would do if he was difficult, how she would manage it. And then he wasn't difficult. He was just a competent foreman who had missed something and wanted to understand why and was practical enough not to let pride prevent him from learning. "The thing you described," he said at one point, "about paying attention to what you don't expect to see. I've been thinking about that since November." "And," she said. "I think I see what you mean," he said. "I know this operation. I know it real well. Maybe too well in the sense you're talking about." He looked at the fence line they were standing beside. "I don't see the things that don't fit what I already know, because I already know too much." "That's exactly it," she said. "The question to ask yourself every time you walk a fence line or check the barn or look at the sky is, what am I expecting to see, and what am I therefore likely to miss?" He thought about that for a long moment. "That's a discipline," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It takes practice. The good news is that the more you do it, the faster you get." Grissom looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has genuinely learned something and is acknowledging it in the way men of his generation and disposition acknowledged things, not effusively, not verbally, really just with that particular shift in the eyes that meant the thing had landed. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I'll tell you something. When Alderman told me he was bringing in a consultant from Nathaniel Brooks's operation, I thought, well..." He stopped. "I know what you thought," she said. "I was wrong," he said simply. "You didn't have enough information yet," she said. "Now you do." She rode back to Red Hollow in the late afternoon with the consulting notes written up and a list of recommendations for Cottonwood Ridge that she had organized in order of urgency. The roan moved well under her, sure-footed in the packed snow, and the light was going golden the way it did in the Wyoming winter. At that hour, everything it touched turned briefly valuable. She was almost back to the ranch when she saw Nathaniel on horseback coming the other direction. He had clearly been out checking the east fence line. He had mentioned it at breakfast, one of the sections she had flagged in December that the ground freeze had delayed. He pulled up when he saw her. She pulled up. They sat their horses on the road in the January cold, with about 10 feet between them. "How was Cottonwood Ridge?" he said. "Good," she said. Grissom is a solid man. He's going to be an excellent student." She paused. "I left them a written copy of the storm preparation protocol. Alderman wants to implement it before the next major weather event." "Good," Nathaniel said. "The east fence?" she said. "3 sections need work," he said. "I've got it in my head to start on the post replacement next week if the ground softens." "I'll add it to the schedule," she said. He nodded. They sat there for a moment in the way of two people who have more to say than is strictly practical to say on a cold road in January on horseback. Then Nathaniel said, "Alderman told me something when I ran into him in town last week." She waited. "He said he'd been talking to some of the other Valley ranchers," Nathaniel said, "about formalizing what you've been doing. Not just the consulting visits, but something more structured. A valley-wide preparation protocol. Common standards for storm preparation infrastructure assessment, that kind of thing." He paused. "He wants you to lead it." Eleanor was still. "Lead it," she said. "Write the standards," Nathaniel said. "Organize the protocol. Get the ranches on the same page so that what happened to Cottonwood Ridge and Patterson's Place and Dawson's never happens again, because everybody was prepared the way we were prepared." He held her gaze. "He said, and again I'm quoting him, that you're the only person in the valley who actually understands what the problem is, and that the logical thing is to put the person who understands the problem in charge of solving it." The wind moved through the bare trees along the road. Eleanor thought about a greenish-yellow sky over the Dakota Badlands and her father going quiet. She thought about 11 cattle and a family that froze. She thought about 3 years of swept floors and quiet inventory lists and things she had noticed and not said. She thought about a window in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard and Tom Briggs standing in the barn doorway saying, "What do you need?" and Nathaniel at the kitchen table saying, "What's your recommendation?" and Alderman on this same road 3 months ago, with the shocked face of a man confronting evidence that had overturned something he had believed. She thought about the log sitting on the kitchen table. She thought about Cody's good eye on the east paddock fence post. She thought about Pete pouring her coffee. She thought about how long it had taken. How much had been lost in the years of not asking, not listening, not seeing what was right in front of everyone. How many cattle and how many buildings and how many men like Walt who had paid the price for the gap between what people assumed and what was actually true. She was not going to waste time on anger about that. She never had been, really. Anger was not a useful tool in the way that a wrench was a useful tool or a pencil was a useful tool. It didn't fix anything. It just sat in your hand and made it harder to hold the things that did. "Tell Alderman yes," she said. Nathaniel nodded. "Eleanor." His voice was different from his usual voice, not lower exactly, but quieter, more considered. The voice he used when he was saying something that mattered and knew it. She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly without making it a negotiation or a business conversation, just as one person to another." She waited. "The 3 years before the storm," he said. "The way things were. What I let continue, what I didn't see, what I said to you that morning at breakfast." He stopped. Started again. "I think about it. I'm going to think about it for a long time probably. Not because I want to carry it around as a punishment, but because I think I should understand it properly. What it cost you. What it cost the ranch." He looked at her directly. "What almost happened because I was looking at the wrong things." She held his gaze. "Nothing almost happened," she said carefully. "The storm came and the ranch survived. Because of you," he said. "Despite me. Because of the work," she said. "Mine and Tom's and the boys. And because when it counted you listened." "Late," he said. "Late," she agreed. "But you did." He absorbed that. "Is that enough?" he said. It was a real question. Not a rhetorical one, not a performance of humility, a genuine question from a man who was not sure of the answer and wanted hers. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without either softening it or making it harder than it was. "It's a start," she said. "And a start is not nothing. A start is how you build something. The road was quiet between them. I'm going to keep listening, he said. Whatever that's worth. It's worth a great deal, she said. In my experience, it's the rarest thing there is. She clicked her tongue to the roan and moved forward, and he turned his horse beside her, and they rode back to the ranch side by side in the fading winter light with the cold on their faces and the road solid under them. At the gate he got down to open it for her. She rode through. He remounted. They came into the yard together, and the hands were moving between the barn and the bunkhouse, and the smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney, and everything was ordinary and known, and also underneath permanently changed. Cody came out of the barn and looked at them and said, Miss Eleanor, that corner post on the south paddock, the one I mentioned yesterday. Add it to the schedule, she said. Third priority after the east fence sections. Yes, ma'am, he said, without hesitation. Without any of the residual awkwardness that had been in his voice 3 months ago when she had told him he'd wrapped the burlap wrong. Just yes, ma'am, and turning back to the barn. She dismounted and handed the roan's reins to Pete, who had appeared at her elbow in the way he had developed of appearing when she came back from a ride, not because she had asked him to, but because he had decided it was his job and had quietly given it to himself. Good ride, Pete said. Productive, she said. There's coffee, he said. I kept it warm. She walked toward the kitchen, and she did not look back, and she did not need to, because the sounds of the ranch were all around her, the horses and the men and the creak of the barn door that was still on the list, and she knew every note of it, the way you know the sound of your own name. She hung up her coat. She washed her hands. She opened the log to a fresh page, dated it February 4th, 1885, and began to write. Cottonwood Ridge Assessment complete. Valley Protocol Framework, begin draft. Recommendations to aldermen by end of week. She wrote everything down the way she always had. Only now the paper was in a log on a table in a kitchen where people came to ask her questions, and her name was on the supply orders. And Cody was adding fence posts to her schedule, and Nathaniel Brooks was riding in from the east field asking for her opinion on the timber. And somewhere out across the valley, ranchers who had lost cattle in November were reading the protocols she had written, and wrapping their pipes, and checking their beams, and learning to look at the sky the way she had always looked at it, not for what they expected to see, but for what was actually there. Eleanor Hayes had never wanted revenge. She had never wanted anyone to grovel or suffer or feel small. She had only ever wanted the simplest and most difficult thing there is. She had wanted to be heard. And across the whole wide valley of Wyoming territory, in the bitter, clean winter of 1885, the land itself was finally listening, because the woman who had spent 3 years learning every secret it held had finally been given the pen and the authority and the table and the uninterrupted quiet in which to write it all down. She had been the cook. She had been the invisible woman in the kitchen. She had been the one nobody counted, the one nobody asked, the one nobody saw, until the sky turned green and the wind came screaming down from the north, and everything they had built started shaking at its weakest points. And when all of that happened, when the whole proud edifice of what men thought they knew was tested against what the storm actually was, Eleanor Hayes had been the only one standing who already knew exactly what to do. That was not luck. That was not circumstance. That was 3 years of watching and learning and preparing and waiting for the moment when the truth of a thing would finally be louder than the assumptions built up around it. The storm had been that moment. And Eleanor Hayes, operations manager, consultant, the woman with the log and the pencil, and the name on the supply orders, had walked through it with her eyes open and her hands steady, and come out the other side, not as someone who had been proved right, but as someone who had always been right, and was at long last in a position to do something about it. She picked up her pencil. She had work to do.